A billionaire is dying in the middle of $1 million dinner. His private doctor stands there watching. His bodyguards stand there watching. A room full of degrees, power, and expensive suits, all of them just watching. And the only person who steps forward is a waitress. But this is not a hero story. This is the story of a man who built an entire empire from cold stone, and an ordinary woman he had never once noticed, who forced him to face a truth that could destroy everything he had spent his life protecting. If you've ever felt invisible in a room full of important people, stay with me. Watch this story all the way to the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The thing about Ethan Kross was that he never looked sick. That was the most dangerous part. He stood 6'1", broad-shouldered, with the kind of posture that came not from confidence but from years of forcing himself to appear unbreakable, even when everything underneath was quietly falling apart. His dark hair was always cut the same way, short on the sides, slightly longer on top, never a strand out of place. His suits were custom. His shoes were hand-stitched Italian leather that cost more than most people's monthly rent. His watch, a matte black Patek Philippe that he wore so casually it almost looked cheap, was worth $400,000. At 32 years old, Ethan Kross was the youngest self-made billionaire in the Midwest and one of the most closely watched figures in American tech. Kross Technologies had started as a two-person software firm operating out of a rented office in Wicker Park when Ethan was 24. 8 years later, it employed 14,000 people across 3 continents, held government contracts worth hundreds of millions, and was in the middle of a $6.2 billion acquisition deal that would make it one of the 5 most powerful private data infrastructure companies in the country. He had built all of it himself, brick by brick, deal by deal, 18-hour day by 18-hour day. And he had done most of it while quietly, privately, suffocating. Not emotionally, not metaphorically, literally. The attacks had started about 2 years ago, though Ethan could never pinpoint the exact first time. It began as tightness, a strange constriction in his chest during a board meeting in February, the kind he chalked up to stress and forgot about by the time he got to his car. Then it happened again 3 weeks later. This time in the middle of a phone call. His throat had simply closed. For about 8 seconds, he couldn't pull in any air at all. His vision narrowed, his fingers went cold, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, it passed. He had told no one. Ethan Kross did not tell people things. That was not how he operated. He had learned early, very early, in the kind of childhood that leaves marks you don't talk about at dinner parties, that showing vulnerability meant giving someone a weapon. His father had taught him that, not through words but through example, through watching the man get eaten alive by people who had once called themselves his partners. So when the throat spasms started, Ethan did what he always did with problems. He contained them. He found a private specialist, Dr. Raymond Holt, a pulmonologist recommended through a discreet network used by Chicago's wealthiest families, and had the situation managed quietly, professionally, and far outside the reach of anyone who might use the information against him. Holt was good at appearances. He spoke in a calm, measured voice that made complicated things sound simple. He had silver hair and a firm handshake, and an office in Lincoln Park that smelled like leather and old money. He prescribed a rotating combination of medications, some for inflammation, some for nerve regulation, some that Ethan didn't fully understand but took, because Holt explained them with the kind of authoritative certainty that made questioning feel foolish. The attacks didn't stop, but they became manageable, predictable almost. Ethan learned his triggers, learned to feel the early warning signs, learned to excuse himself from rooms before things got bad. He had been managing it for 2 years. He was very good at managing things. What he was not good at, what he had never been good at, was asking for help. There was one exception to Ethan's rule about vulnerability, and she was 8 years old and currently in the back seat of his Mercedes, arguing with her tablet. "The answer is wrong," Mia said flatly, not looking up. "The app or you?" Ethan asked. "The app, obviously. 7 times 8 is 56, not 57. It keeps saying 57. Maybe you're pressing the wrong number." Mia finally looked up. She had her mother's eyes, dark brown and uncommonly direct, and Ethan's stubborn jaw. She stared at him with the specific kind of patience that only children use on adults they have decided are being deliberately dense. Dad, I know how to press a number. I know you do. He kept his eyes on the road. I'm just saying, double check before you decide the whole system is wrong. I double checked. The system is wrong. He almost smiled. Almost. Then report the bug. Mia considered this seriously, which was how she considered everything. How? There's a feedback button, usually at the bottom of the screen. She went back to the tablet. 30 seconds of silence, then, found it. Submitting. A pause. Done. I told them the answer is wrong and that my dad says bugs are just problems nobody fixed yet. This time he did smile, just briefly, in the way he allowed himself when it was only the two of them. Mia Cross was the one genuinely uncomplicated thing in Ethan's life, which was its own kind of complicated because she was also the one thing he could not afford to lose. Her mother, Jessica, had left when Mia was 18 months old. Not dramatically, not with screaming or lawyers or betrayal, but quietly, in the way some people leave when they realize they've married an idea of someone rather than the actual person. Jessica had remarried a landscape architect in Portland and sent birthday cards that were always on time and always slightly generic. Mia referred to her as my mom in Oregon, with the easy detachment of a child who had simply organized the information into available categories. Ethan had raised her alone, with help. A live-in nanny named Mrs. Patricia Ozzie, who had been with them for 5 years and who was, if Ethan were honest, probably the primary reason Mia was as emotionally functional as she was, but alone in the way that mattered. He was the one who showed up to school plays and parent-teacher conferences and emergency room visits for the broken arm at age 6. He was the one who sat on the edge of her bed when she had nightmares and couldn't always think of the right thing to say, but stayed anyway. He was not a warm father. He knew that. Warmth was not a language he'd been taught, but he was a present father, and he had decided early on that presence would have to be enough. Tonight, he was dropping Mia at Mrs. Osei's apartment for the evening while he attended what his head of investor relations had described as the most important dinner of Q3. The Harlow Room at the top of the Meridian Hotel. 12 international investors. A $6.2 billion deal that needed reassurance after 2 weeks of market turbulence had made everyone nervous. Are you going to be late? Mia asked. Probably. How late? I don't know, Mia. Past 10? Maybe. She absorbed this. Mrs. Osei said she'd make jollof rice. That's good. She puts the crispy part at the bottom. I know she does. You should come have some when you get back, even if it's late. Ethan glanced at her in the rearview mirror. She was looking out the window now, watching the city lights begin to blur past as they crossed the bridge. She said it casually, the way kids say things they mean very seriously, but have learned not to say directly because they've noticed adults get uncomfortable with directness. I'll try, he said. It wasn't a promise. They both knew it wasn't a promise. But it was something, and for Mia, something was enough. For now. The Meridian Hotel occupied the top 12 floors of a glass tower on Michigan Avenue, and the Harlow Room occupied the very top of that. A private dining space reserved exclusively for guests whose net worth cleared 10 figures, or whose names appeared on enough board seats to amount to the same thing. The room itself was obscenely beautiful in the way only spaces designed to impress other obscenely wealthy people could be. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Michigan, hand-poured concrete walls that somehow felt warm. Lighting calibrated so precisely that everyone in the room appeared slightly better looking than they actually were. The tables were set with linen so heavy it barely moved in the air conditioning, and the silverware was the kind that made a satisfying, solid sound when you set it down. The staff had been briefed 3 days in advance. There were 12 of them working the room tonight. 6 servers, 2 sommeliers, a maitre d', 2 runners, and a floor supervisor named Gerald Marks, who had worked at the Meridian for 19 years and who communicated primarily through a system of eyebrow movements that his staff had learned to read like a second language. Clara Bennett was one of the 6 servers. She had been at the Meridian for 8 months, which made her the 3rd most junior member of the floor staff, which meant she normally worked the second dining room on the 41st floor, the one reserved for guests who were wealthy, but not wealthy enough for the Harlow Room. Tonight she was here because Annette, one of the regulars, had called in sick that afternoon with what Gerald described as allegedly a migraine, with the tone of a man who had long since stopped taking sick calls at face value. Clara had gotten the call at 4:30. She had exactly 90 minutes to get across the city from her apartment in Logan Square, change into the uniform kept in her locker, review the evening's menu with the kitchen, and be on the floor by 6. She made it by 6:02. Gerald clocked her arrival with a single raised eyebrow that communicated, acceptable, but not again. Clara Bennett was 30 years old and had been described, at various points in her life, as quiet, careful, and easy to overlook. She was medium height, with brown hair she kept pulled back on the job, and she had the kind of face that looked younger than her age. Not in a striking way, just in the way that made people occasionally ask if she was a student. Her hands were slightly rough from years of work and from the endless hand-washing that came with the job, and she had a small scar on the inside of her left forearm from a kitchen accident 3 years ago at a different restaurant that she no longer thought about. She was not particularly memorable, which was something she had made her peace with a long time ago. What she was, and what almost nobody who looked at her guessed, was deeply, specifically knowledgeable about one thing that had nothing to do with food service: airway emergencies. Her younger brother Danny was 26 years old and had suffered from a severe laryngeal hyperreactivity disorder since childhood, a condition involving unpredictable, violent spasms of the muscles controlling the upper airway that could, in their worst form, cause complete respiratory obstruction within seconds. Danny had been hospitalized 11 times. He had nearly died twice. The second time, when Clara was 22 and Danny was 18 and their mother was already gone and their father was not the kind of person you called in a crisis, Clara had been the only one there. She had learned everything there was to learn, not theoretically, not from pamphlets, from being the person in the room when it happened over and over, until she could read the signs in the first 2 seconds and respond before most people had even registered that something was wrong. She had also spent 2 years in nursing school before Danny's last hospitalization had made working full-time a financial necessity rather than a choice. But she didn't think about nursing school much anymore. That was another thing she'd made her peace with. Tonight, she moved through the Harlow room with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned to take up as little space as possible, refilling glasses without being asked, clearing plates at the exact right moment, reading the rhythm of each table, the way you learn to read people when you've spent years doing it. She was good at her job. Not in a way that anyone in this room would remember or remark on. Just good, in the quiet, consistent way that keeps things running. She had been on the floor for about 2 hours when she first noticed the man at table 1. Table 1 was where Ethan Cross sat. He was at the head of the arrangement. Not formally, there was no head at a round table, but the way the other 11 men positioned themselves made it clear who the center of gravity was. He was younger than most of them by at least a decade, which should have made him look out of place. Instead, he looked like the only one who belonged there, which Clara had noticed was a thing some people just had, a quality of presence that made their specific location feel correct regardless of context. She had served his table twice, water the first time, a bread course the second. He hadn't looked at her either time, which she expected and didn't take personally. In rooms like this, servers were infrastructure. What she noticed, what made something quiet and instinctive in the back of her mind tilt slightly sideways, was the way he swallowed. It was a small thing, the kind of thing you'd never notice unless you'd spent years watching for it. Twice in the first hour, she saw him pause mid-sentence, very briefly, with a slight tightening around his jaw. The kind of micro-expression that crossed a face when swallowing suddenly required conscious effort instead of happening automatically. She noticed it the first time and filed it away. She noticed it the second time and felt something sharpen inside her. She said nothing. It wasn't her place. She was a server in a room full of billionaires, and she had, quite literally, been handed a 3-page briefing document about not making unnecessary contact with the primary guests. She kept working. By the time the main course arrived, a dry-aged Wagyu beef with a truffle demi-glace that the kitchen had spent 2 days preparing, Ethan Cross had been at the table for 2 hours and 15 minutes and had consumed, as far as Clara could track, roughly a quarter of his food and a full glass of water with what appeared to be increasing deliberateness. She was at the service station near the east wall, checking the temperature on a bottle of Burgundy, when she heard the change in his voice. It was subtle, A slight roughness that hadn't been there before. Not laryngitis, not fatigue, but a constriction. Like something was pressing on the outside of his windpipe from the inside. She set the bottle down. Across the room, Ethan had shifted slightly in his chair. He placed one hand flat on the table, not dramatically, not in a way that would draw attention, but with the specific careful stillness of a person managing something they don't want anyone to see. Clara was already moving toward the edge of the room. Not toward the table, not yet, but closer. One of the other servers, a man named Paul, who had been at the Meridian for 6 years, stepped up beside her. "You good?" he asked quietly, because he had noticed her attention had shifted. "That man at table 1, she said quietly, not looking away. "Watch his breathing." Paul looked. "He looks fine." "He's not fine." Paul frowned but didn't argue. He had learned in 6 years that the quiet ones were sometimes right about the things the loud ones missed. 30 seconds later, Ethan Cross stopped speaking mid-sentence. The man to his left, a heavyset German investor named Klaus Brenner, who had been speaking animatedly about real estate, didn't notice at first, continuing his point for another 3 seconds before the silence from Ethan's side of the table finally registered. "Ethan?" The Investor Relations VP, Marcus Webb, was the first to say his name. "You okay?" Ethan had both hands on the table now. His face was very still in the way that faces go still when the brain is directing all available resources to a single problem. His jaw was set. His throat was working. The tendons visible, the muscles pulling tight and then releasing and then pulling tight again. And then his face began to change color. Not dramatically. Not the purple-faced gasping of movie scenes. Just a slow, creeping pale. A draining of the normal flush from his cheeks as the oxygen in his blood started moving in the wrong direction. "Ethan." Marcus was standing now. "Ethan, what's—" And then Ethan Cross, billionaire, CEO, man who had never let anyone see him fall, tipped sideways out of his chair and hit the floor. The room detonated. What happened in the next 45 seconds was something Clara would replay in her mind for a long time afterward. Not because it was dramatic, though it was, but because of the specific revealing quality of how people respond when a situation exceeds the boundaries of what they've prepared for. The investors lurched backward from the table. 2 of them stood and immediately looked at each other as if waiting for someone else to decide what the correct facial expression was. Klaus Brenner said something in German that nobody translated. Marcus Webb was on his phone before Ethan had even fully hit the ground, calling 911 with a panicked efficiency that was technically the right thing to do, but would not help in the next 3 minutes. Ethan's personal assistant, a sharp young man named David Chen, who had been stationed near the door, rushed forward and then stopped about 4 feet away, looking at his boss on the floor with an expression of pure, helpless horror. Dr. Raymond Holt, who had been seated at a separate table near the window in an advisory capacity, and who was, by all documentation, Ethan's private physician, stood up, assessed the situation, reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, and pulled out a small case containing a preloaded syringe. He moved toward Ethan, and Clara Bennett moved faster. She wasn't running. Running in a room full of panicking wealthy people was how you caused a second emergency. She moved the way she'd trained herself to move, quickly, deliberately, with the specific quality of purpose that parts crowds without demanding they part. She was past the service station and through the gap between 2 overturned chairs and beside Ethan Cross on the floor before any of the 3 bodyguards stationed at the room's perimeter had processed what they were supposed to do. "Who are you?" one of them started. "Airway emergency," she said, not to him but to herself, the words functioning less as communication and more as a diagnostic checklist. She was already on her knees beside Ethan, 2 fingers pressed to the side of his neck. Pulse there. Fast. But there. His lips were going bluish at the corners. His throat was visibly contracting. The laryngeal muscles in full spasm, the airway locked. She'd seen this before. She'd seen it in a hospital room in the middle of the night with Danny, age 18, and she had been 22 years old and completely terrified and completely alone, and she had done it then and she would do it now. "Don't touch him." One of the bodyguards had reached her and grabbed her by the shoulder. "Get your hand off me," she said with a flatness that, later, when people tried to describe what happened, Several witnesses would call the most quietly authoritative thing they'd ever heard from a person in a service uniform. "I know what this is." She didn't wait for his response. She repositioned Ethan's head, careful, angled, tilting it back just slightly to create the optimal line from the trachea upward. Then she placed the heel of one hand on the upper chest just below the sternum and applied controlled specific pressure, not the blunt force of a chest compression, but a precise, rhythmic stimulation targeted at the diaphragm and the laryngeal reflex point she had learned from a thoracic specialist who had explained the technique to her in a hospital corridor at 2 a.m. because she had simply stood there and refused to leave until she understood. "This is wrong," Dr. Holt said from somewhere above her. "You need to let me administer." "What are you giving him?" she said, not stopping. "Epinephrine, and he doesn't need epinephrine. That will make it worse." She didn't know how she was this calm. She had wondered about that later. "This is laryngeal spasm. Epinephrine will increase laryngeal tension. You will kill him." Dead silence. Absolute ringing silence from every person in the room. Holt did not move. Clara kept her hands exactly where they were. 3 seconds. 4. 5. And then, not dramatically, not with a cinematic gasp, Ethan Cross took a breath. It was shallow. It was rough. It sounded like gravel dragged through a narrow pipe, but it was air moving in the right direction, and his color began to shift, that terrible pale blue retreating slightly, a flush of something almost normal beginning to return to his face. She felt the tension under her hands begin to release, the muscles slowly, grudgingly, letting go. She kept her hands still until she was sure. Then she sat back on her heels and looked at the man on the floor. His eyes were open, dark, and slightly unfocused, the way eyes look when the brain is still catching up to the fact that the crisis has passed. He was looking directly at her. Clara Bennett looked back. She wasn't thinking about the $1 million he had promised, somewhere in the chaos, to whoever saved him. She hadn't even registered that announcement in the middle of everything. She wasn't thinking about her job or the confidentiality agreement she'd be handed in the morning, or any of the ways this night was going to complicate her life. She was thinking about the way Dr. Holt had hesitated. Not panicked, not confused. Hesitated. Like a man who had done a quick internal calculation before deciding whether to act. The room was still completely silent around her. 12 investors, a dozen staff members, 2 assistants, 3 bodyguards, all of them staring at a woman in a server's uniform kneeling on an expensive floor. Ethan Cross tried to say something. His voice came out as a rough scrape of sound, barely a word. But his eyes were clear, sharpening by the second, and he was looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not gratitude. Not exactly. More like the look of a man who has just discovered that something he believed was solid was not solid, and he is still working out what that means. She should have stood up and stepped back. That would have been the professional thing to do. The appropriate thing. The invisible thing. Instead, she met his gaze and said quietly, in a voice that only he could hear, "Your doctor was going to make it worse." Ethan Cross said nothing, but he didn't look away. The paramedics arrived 11 minutes after Marcus Webb's call. By then, Ethan was sitting upright, his back against the side of the overturned chair, his breathing slow and deliberate. He had refused to lie down when someone suggested it, which was, Clara thought, probably the most on-brand thing he could have done. She had stepped back when the EMTs arrived, stepped all the way back to the service station, where Paul was standing with the expression of someone who had witnessed something he did not have an adequate category for. "How did you know what to do?" he asked. "My brother," she said simply. And then she started collecting the water glasses that still needed to be cleared from the abandoned tables, because she didn't know what else to do with her hands. Across the room, one of Ethan's people, she thought it was David Chen, the assistant, was trying to speak to him quietly while the paramedics did their assessment. Ethan was answering in short sentences, his voice still rough, his eyes moving across the room with a focused, scanning quality. The way a chess player looks at a board, not at any single piece, but at the whole arrangement. His eyes found her once, briefly, across the length of the room. She looked down at the glass in her hand. Gerald Marks appeared at her elbow. His expression was, for once, completely unreadable, which, in a man whose face functioned as a precise emotional communication system, meant he was dealing with something outside his operational range. "Bennett," he said. "Yes." A pause. "Are you—" I'm fine. Another pause. What you did, I just... She stopped. Started again. I knew what it was. I've seen it before. Gerald looked at her for a long moment. He was a man who had spent 19 years watching people move through rooms under pressure, and he had developed over that time a fairly accurate intuition for who people actually were beneath their performance. He thought he had Clara Bennett figured out. A good worker, quiet, competent in an unremarkable way. A placeholder until someone more interesting came along. He was revising that assessment in real time. Go take 10 minutes, he said finally. Outside. I don't need... That wasn't a question. She went. The service corridor behind the Harlow room smelled like clean linen and stainless steel. Clara leaned against the wall and looked at the ceiling and let herself, for exactly 30 seconds, feel the full weight of what had just happened. Then she straightened up, pressed her palms flat against the cold metal of the shelving unit beside her, and breathed. Her brother Danny needed surgery. Had needed it for 8 months. His condition had progressed to the point where the spasms were happening with increasing frequency, and the conservative management that had gotten him through his 20s was no longer enough. The surgical option, a specific laryngeal reconstruction procedure performed by a small number of specialists in the country, cost, with the facility fees and the post-operative care, somewhere in the range of $210,000. Danny's insurance covered $40,000. Clara was supporting both of them on her salary from the Meridian and the occasional freelance shift at a catering company. She had a savings account with $11,000 in it, which she was aware of down to the exact dollar because she checked it every Sunday morning like a person tending something fragile. She had heard what Ethan Cross said before he collapsed. She had caught it in the chaos, a fragment of words delivered in a strained voice to the room. $1 million. Anyone who can... He hadn't finished the sentence. She hadn't processed it fully in the moment. Standing in the service corridor, she processed it now. She pressed her hands harder against the shelving unit. She had not done what she did for money. She wanted to be clear about that, at least to herself. In this corridor where nobody could see her and she had no reason to be anything other than honest. She had done it because a man was dying and she knew how to help, and the only alternative was to stand there and watch, which was not something she was built to do. But the money existed. The promise had been made in front of witnesses, and Danny needed that surgery. She allowed herself to think about it for exactly 20 more seconds. Then she went back to work. By the time the paramedics cleared Ethan to remain at the venue, he had refused transport to the hospital with the grim determination of a man who considered hospitalization a form of public defeat. Most of the investors had been quietly escorted to a private lounge on the floor below, where Marcus Webb was conducting emergency damage control with a bottle of 20-year scotch, and the kind of forced calm that takes years of investor relations training to perfect. Ethan Cross sat at the cleared table, jacket off, collar loosened, his private security lead standing 3 feet away like a man who had failed at his one job and was not sure what to do about it. David Chen stood to his right with a tablet and an expression that mixed profound relief with the beginnings of logistical anxiety. There were calls to make. Statements to draft. The evening's events would be on financial news by midnight, regardless of what anyone did. Ethan knew all of this. He was not thinking about any of it. He was thinking about the woman in the server's uniform who had put her hands on him without asking permission and told his doctor, calmly, flatly, in front of a room full of witnesses, that the doctor was about to kill him. He was thinking about the way she had said it, not accusatory, not dramatic, just factual. The way you state something you have verified personally and have no interest in arguing about. Who was she? He said. David looked up from the tablet. I'm sorry? The server. The one who... He paused. His throat was still rough, and speaking at certain pitches required more effort than it should have. The one who helped me. David typed something, looked at something. Clara Bennett. She's been with the Meridian for 8 months. Normally works 41. She was up here covering a sick call. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Find her. David didn't hesitate. He'd learned not to hesitate at instructions that were delivered in that particular tone. He went. Marcus Webb appeared from the direction of the elevator, loosening his tie by a 1/4 inch, which, for Marcus, was the equivalent of total emotional collapse. Ethan, the Morgenstern people want a statement. Brenner is asking whether draft something. Medical incident, fully managed, all scheduled activities proceeding as planned. Ethan's voice was flat and routine, the words coming from some autopilot part of him that handled crisis communications while the rest of him was occupied elsewhere. Don't use the word collapse. Use medical episode. Marcus absorbed this with the practiced neutrality of someone who had been managing Billionaire PR for 15 years. And the promise you made? Before what promise? Marcus's expression flickered. You said, before you, when you were... He cleared his throat. You told the room you'd give $1 million to anyone who helped you. Ethan looked at him. Several people heard it, Marcus said carefully, including at least 2 who will absolutely mention it if we don't address it. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then we address it, he said. Marcus nodded, relieved. I'll have legal draft something, a thank you payment, properly structured, non-binding in terms of... I said I'd pay it, Ethan said. I'll pay it. Marcus stopped. Ethan, I don't need your opinion on this, Marcus. Silence. Find out, Ethan said slowly, what she needs. Clara was clearing the final table when David Chen found her. He was young, couldn't have been more than 25, and he had the slightly dazed quality of someone still processing an evening that had deviated significantly from the plan. He approached her the way people approach servers when they're not sure of the social protocol, with that combination of deference and entitlement that comes from being important enough to have a personal assistant, but not yet comfortable enough in one's own importance to wear it naturally. Ms. Bennett? She looked up. Yes? Mr. Cross would like to speak with you, if you have a moment. Clara set down the stack of plates in her hands. She looked at David Chen for a second, reading his face the way she read faces, for the thing underneath the thing. Is he all right? David blinked. He had clearly expected a different response. Yes, the paramedics cleared him. Yes. Good, she said, and she picked the plates back up. David stared. Miss Bennett, Mr. Cross is... I know who he is. She wasn't rude about it, just direct. Tell him I'll be a few minutes. I need to finish the table. David Chen opened his mouth, closed it, sent a very brief text on his phone, then stood and waited with the expression of someone receiving feedback from his employer in real time through a screen. Clara finished clearing the table. She carried the plates to the kitchen pass. She untied her apron and folded it over her arm, and then, because she noticed her hands were very slightly unsteady in a way she hadn't let herself register until this moment, she stood at the kitchen pass for 5 seconds and made them be still. Then she went to find Ethan Cross. He was sitting where David had described, at the main table, jacket off, the expensive evidence of the evening's disaster cleared away around him. He looked, she thought, simultaneously less and more than he had at the beginning of the night. Less polished. The collar open, the careful surface slightly abraded by what had happened, but also somehow more real, the way things look when you see them stripped of their presentation. He watched her approach. She stopped at a professional distance and looked at him steadily. You wanted to speak with me, she said. I did. His voice was still rough. Sit down. She stayed standing, not defiantly, just... There was something in the way he had issued the instruction that she didn't quite want to comply with, on a purely instinctive level. Something crossed his face. Possibly the first time in recent memory that someone in a service uniform had declined to follow an instruction from him. He processed it. Then, with a very slight adjustment of his expression that might have been the beginning of respect, Please. She sat. They looked at each other across the table for a moment. Two people from entirely different worlds, both slightly off balance in different ways, both being more honest in this moment than they intended. What you did, he started. Stopped. I knew what it was, she said again. You told my doctor he was wrong. He was wrong. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. He's been treating me for 2 years. Clara looked at him and then said something she probably shouldn't have said, but that came out anyway, the way things do when you're tired and the filter is temporarily offline. Then why do you keep having attacks? The silence that followed was not comfortable. It was the kind of silence that happens when a question exposes something the listener has been very deliberately not looking at. Ethan Cross was quiet for so long that she thought she'd crossed a line she couldn't uncross. Then he said, quietly, in a voice entirely stripped of its corporate surface. I don't know. And for the first time that evening, Clara felt something other than clinical focus. She felt the specific, exhausting weight of a person who has been managing something alone for too long. She recognized it because she had carried it herself for years, and she still wasn't entirely sure she'd put it down. I have a brother, she said. He has the same condition. I've been watching it for most of my adult life. She paused. I think you need a second opinion, from someone who isn't Dr. Holt. Ethan looked at her. I'm not a doctor, she added. I'm aware of that. You were in nursing school, he said, which surprised her. She hadn't told him that. Your assistant does fast work, she said. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but the outline of one. I keep my promises, he said. His voice had shifted. Not softer exactly, but more direct, less performance. What I said tonight before I heard. $1 million to whoever I heard. He looked at her. Most people would have said yes faster than I could finish the sentence. I'm not most people, she said, which she didn't mean to sound sharp but came out that way slightly. I did it because you needed help, not because of the money. I know that, he said, and somehow she believed him. But, she said, and then she stopped. He waited. My brother needs surgery, she said carefully. The same condition, but worse. He's needed it for 8 months. She told him the number, $210,000, the insurance gap. She told him in the same flat, factual way she'd told him his doctor was wrong, because she had decided somewhere in the last 3 hours that she was done with the particular social performance of pretending not to need things. Ethan Cross listened. Then he looked at her for a long moment with that same unreadable expression, the one she'd seen on the floor, when his eyes had first focused on her face. I'll handle it, he said. I'm not asking for charity. I know you're not. He held her gaze. I promised $1 million. And you're telling me your brother needs surgery. I can do the math. Clara Bennett looked at Ethan Cross across the wreckage of the most expensive dinner service she'd ever worked. She was trying to decide if she believed him. Really believed him, not in the way you believe a powerful man when he says something because it's easier than doubting him, but in the actual examined way. She hadn't decided yet. I'll be back tomorrow, she said finally. To talk about your medication. He blinked. You're serious. Someone needs to be. She stood, refolded her apron, looked at him once more. He was watching her with an expression she would think about later, in her apartment in Logan Square, lying awake at 3 a.m. with the city outside her window and her brother's hospital folder on the kitchen table. It was the expression of a man who had been alone in something for a very long time and had just, unexpectedly, in the worst possible circumstances, met someone who understood exactly what he'd been carrying. She left without looking back. Ethan Cross sat alone in the Harlow room for a long time after that, and for the first time in 2 years, he breathed without counting. She got home at 12:43 in the morning. Logan Square was quiet at that hour. Not the dead quiet of suburbs, but the specific Chicago quiet of a neighborhood that had burned hard all evening and was now just breathing. The last few bars still leaking music into the street, a couple arguing 2 floors above her in a language she couldn't identify, a dog somewhere doing its anxious 3 a.m. bark at nothing. Clara had lived in this apartment for 4 years, and she knew all its sounds. The way you know the sounds of something you've stopped consciously hearing. She locked the door behind her, didn't turn on the overhead light, stood in the dark for a moment with her back against the door and her work shoes still on, and just let the silence of the apartment be what it was. Danny's folder was on the kitchen table where she'd left it that morning. It was a manila folder, thick with printouts and billing statements and insurance correspondence, the corners soft from handling. She developed the habit of leaving it visible. Not because she needed to see it, but because the one time she'd put it in a drawer, she'd gone 3 days without opening it, and the bills had gotten worse in the interim. Better to leave it out. Better to look at it every morning and every night until looking at it stopped feeling like a punch and started feeling like just a fact. She sat down at the kitchen table without taking off her coat, opened the folder, looked at the number she already knew by heart. $210,000, minus the $40,000 that insurance had agreed in writing to cover. A number that had taken 8 months of phone calls and appeals and one actual letter from a patient advocacy lawyer to extract. That left $170,000 that needed to come from somewhere. Her savings account had $11,240 in it. She had done the math so many times she didn't need a calculator anymore. She closed the folder, pushed it back to its spot in the center of the table. Then she sat there in her coat in the dark kitchen and thought about what Ethan Cross had said. "I'll handle it." She wanted to believe him. She was aware of the wanting, and she was suspicious of it because she had learned, through Danny's illness, through the insurance company, through the specific education that comes from being a person without money trying to navigate systems built for people with it, that wanting to believe something was not the same as having a reason to. Powerful people said things. Sometimes they meant them. More often they meant them in the moment and then forgot them when the moment passed and the lawyers started talking. She pulled out her phone, searched his name. Ethan Cross had a Wikipedia page, a Bloomberg profile, a Forbes ranking, number 47 on the under 40 list, and approximately 412 news articles from the past 3 years. She read 3 of them. They told her what she already knew from working in rooms like the Harlow Room long enough. He was disciplined, he was private, he had built something real from nothing, and he ran his company with a precision that people who admired him called focused, and people who didn't called cold. There were 2 mentions of his daughter, just 2, in 400 articles. In both of them, he declined to comment. She appreciated that, oddly. The privacy of it, the deliberateness. She put her phone down. The dog upstairs was still barking. She finally took off her coat. The next morning arrived the way mornings do when you haven't really slept. Not gradually, but all at once. The light through the blinds going from nothing to too much without sufficient transition. Clara lay in her bed for approximately 90 seconds, taking inventory of how her body felt, which was the habit she'd developed over years of shift work and intermittent crisis. Her feet ached. Her lower back had a specific complaint about the 4 hours she'd spent on the marble floor of the Harlow Room. Her mind was already running, which was its default state and the thing she liked least about herself. She got up, made coffee, called Danny. He picked up on the second ring, which meant he'd been awake for a while. He usually was, these days. The spasms had been waking him up at night. Not full attacks, but the early warning tightness that was enough to jolt you awake and leave you sitting up in the dark, waiting to see if it was going to get worse. "Hey," he said. His voice was slightly raspy, which it always was in the morning now. "How was last night?" 2 episodes, small ones. Went back to sleep after. She made herself keep her voice level. "Time?" "Around 2 and 4. "Did you use it?" "Yeah, I used it." He had the tone of someone who had answered this specific question many times. It helped. She wrapped both hands around her coffee mug. "I need to tell you something." A pause on his end. Danny had learned over years of being her brother to read her specific quality of pauses. Good something or bad something? "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "It might be good. I don't want to tell you it's definitely good until I know." "Clara, I was at the Harlow Room last night, covering for Annette." "Okay." "There was a man, a guest. He had an episode." Silence. Then, very quietly, "Like mine." "Exactly like yours." She paused. "I helped him." She could hear Danny processing this, the sound of him sitting up, the slight shift in his breathing. He knew what helping someone through a laryngeal spasm episode meant. He knew what she was when she went into that mode, because he'd been on the receiving end of it enough times to understand it was not a small thing. "Is he okay?" "He's okay." Good. And she believed him. Danny never had the kind of ego that would resent a stranger getting the care he himself needed. That was one of the things she loved about him. "What's the other part?" "He made a promise, before it happened, in front of witnesses." She chose her words carefully because she still wasn't sure, and she did not want to build something in Danny's head that might collapse. "He said he'd give $1 million to anyone who helped him." The silence this time was longer. "Clara, I don't know if he'll follow through. I don't know him, but I told him about you and he said he'd handle it and I don't know." She stopped, started again. "I just wanted you to know, because if it happens, it changes things. And if it doesn't happen, I didn't want you to find out later and feel like I'd kept something from you." Danny was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had the careful quality of someone managing their own hope. What was he like? Hard to read. She thought about it. Not a bad person, I don't think, just complicated. The kind of person who's been alone in something for too long. Danny made a sound that might have been a laugh. You'd know something about that. Danny, I'm just saying. She finished her coffee. I'll call you when I know more. Hey, Clara? Yeah. Whatever happens with the money? What you did last night? You know that matters, right? Regardless. She didn't answer that. She just said goodbye and hung up. Because she was her father's daughter in at least that one way. She did not know what to do with things that were meant as kindness. She arrived at Cross Technologies headquarters at 9:47 in the morning. It was a 43-story building in the West Loop, glass and steel, and deliberately understated in the way that only very expensive architecture manages to be. The kind of building that doesn't try to announce itself because it doesn't need to. The lobby was the size of a small concert hall, with a security desk staffed by 3 people who all looked slightly like they could break something structural with their bare hands if required. Clara was wearing black trousers, a gray blouse, and a dark jacket she'd bought 2 years ago for a job interview at a medical administration company she hadn't gotten. It was the most professional thing she owned that wasn't a uniform. She had her folder under her arm, not Danny's medical folder, but a different one, which she'd assembled at her kitchen table at 6 in the morning, containing the medical documentation she'd gathered over 7 years of managing her brother's condition, research papers, clinical protocols, a specialist's published study on laryngeal spasm intervention techniques. She had spent 2 hours on it before the sun came up. She told the security desk that she was Clara Bennett and she was there to speak with Ethan Cross. She watched their faces do the thing faces do when they're checking a list and finding something they didn't expect to find. A slight recalibration, a micro-adjustment. David Chen came down in the elevator 4 minutes later. He was in a different suit than last night, but he had the same expression. The specific exhaustion of someone who had been on the phone since dawn managing fallout. Ms. Bennett, he said, Mr. Cross is expecting you. She followed him into the elevator. They rode up in the particular silence of 2 people who have recently shared a crisis and haven't yet established the social protocol for what comes after. How is he this morning? She asked. David glanced at her sideways. He's working, he said, which she understood to mean he's exactly as he always is, and he will never tell you otherwise. Of course he is, she said, without judgment. They emerged on the 39th floor into a space that was deliberately less dramatic than the lobby. Open plan, clean lines, the particular hum of a floor where serious work was happening. Heads came up as she walked through, and she was aware of the attention without being rattled by it. She had been the person people looked at in the wrong kind of way for most of her adult life. She had developed a functional indifference to it. Ethan's office was at the corner with windows that looked north and east over the city. He was standing when David opened the door, not at his desk, but at the window, one hand in his pocket, looking out at the skyline with the expression of someone who had been staring at the same point long enough that they'd stopped actually seeing it. He turned when she came in. He was in a different suit. Dark navy, no tie. He looked more rested than she would have expected from a man who'd spent part of the previous evening on an expensive floor turning blue, but there was something around his eyes, a tightness that hadn't been there when she'd first seen him at table 1, that told her the rest had been mostly performative. You came, he said. I said I would. He looked at the folder under her arm. What's that? Documentation. I want to show you something about your medication. He was quiet for a second. Then he gestured toward the chair across from his desk. This time he said please first, which she noticed and didn't remark on. She sat. He sat across from her, and she opened the folder, and for the next 22 minutes she laid out what she'd spent the early morning assembling. She wasn't a doctor. She said so again, up front, clearly, not as a disclaimer, but as a fact. What she was someone who had spent years in proximity to a specific condition and who had, in that time, developed a working knowledge that most civilians didn't have and that some clinicians underestimated. The class of medications Holt had prescribed, she showed Ethan the papers, pointed to the relevant sections, used plain language where she could, had a documented interaction pathway that, in a subset of patients with already sensitized laryngeal tissue, could produce a chronic cycle of inflammation and spasm. Not in everyone. Not even in most people, but in a specific physiological profile that, based on what she'd observed the night before, fit Ethan's presentation fairly precisely. It wasn't proof. She said that too. It was a hypothesis that needed to be tested by an actual specialist. But it was the hypothesis that explained why a man had been getting worse for 2 years under the care of a doctor who was supposed to be making him better. Ethan listened. He didn't interrupt, which surprised her slightly. He was the kind of man who, she suspected, typically redirected conversations that were going somewhere inconvenient. But he sat and he listened and he looked at the papers she slid across the desk with the focused attention of someone who had decided to actually take something seriously. When she finished, he sat back. "Holt trained at Northwestern," he said. Not defensively, just stating it. "I know. I looked him up this morning. He's treated some of the most influential people in the city." "I know that too." A pause. "And you think he's been wrong for 2 years?" "I think," she said carefully, "that the medication protocol is worth reviewing by someone other than the person who prescribed it." Ethan was quiet. He turned slightly toward the window. Outside, Chicago was doing its thing. Relentless, indifferent, the lake flat and gray-blue in the morning light. "My throat felt better this morning than it has in months," he said. It wasn't a concession. It was just a fact he was reporting, like reading a data point off a screen. "The technique I use disrupts the spasm cycle," she said, "but it doesn't fix the underlying trigger. If the medication is the trigger, stopping the medication is the only thing that helps long-term." He looked at her. "You're very direct." "You seem like you can handle direct." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite amusement, but something adjacent to it. "Most people in your position would be asking about the money right now." "I'll ask about the money," she said. "I'm just asking about the medication first." He nodded slowly, something settling in his posture. "Fair enough." He called Dr. Holt's office that afternoon and canceled his standing appointments. Clara didn't know that yet when she left his building at 11:30. She walked out into the West Loop morning with her folder and her jacket and the specific feeling of a person who has done something they needed to do and has no idea what happens next. The city was loud and ordinary around her, which was a relief after the compressed, expensive air of the past 16 hours. Her phone buzzed as she reached the corner. She expected David Chen. It was Gerald Marks. She looked at the screen for a second, then answered, "Bennett." Gerald's voice had its customary economy. "I need you in my office at 2. I have a shift tonight." "I know you have a shift tonight." A pause that carried more information than most people's full sentences. "This is before your shift, 2 o'clock." She arrived at Gerald's office at exactly 2. It was a small room off the service corridor, practical and undecorated except for a framed photo of Gerald with his wife at what appeared to be some kind of fishing tournament, and a whiteboard covered in shift schedules. Gerald was already there, and he wasn't alone. There were 2 other people in the room, a woman Clara didn't recognize in a fitted charcoal suit holding a leather portfolio, and a man in his 50s in a blue blazer who introduced himself with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes as Richard Vaughn, Senior Legal Counsel for Cross Technologies. Clara looked at Gerald. Gerald's expression said, "I didn't have a choice about this." She looked back at Vaughn. "Ms. Bennett," he said, with the practiced warmth of someone who had learned to deliver difficult things gently. "I appreciate you coming in. I wanted to have a quick conversation before things get complicated." He set a thick document folder on Gerald's desk and a white envelope on top of it. "Mr. Cross is deeply grateful for your assistance last night. We want to acknowledge that properly." Clara didn't sit down. She looked at the envelope. "What's in the folder?" she asked. "A standard confidentiality agreement. Given the nature of the situation, Mr. Cross's medical condition, the circumstances, the presence of financial partners, we need to ensure that the details of what occurred remain private. It protects everyone involved, including—" "And the envelope?" Vaughn paused. "A payment. For your discretion and your assistance. We feel it's a generous—" "How much?" He told her the number, $50,000. Clara stood there. She could feel Gerald watching her, and the woman in the suit, and Vaughn with his practiced smile, and she could feel the weight of $50,000 pressing against the $11,000 in her savings account, and the folder on her kitchen table with the number she knew by heart. She picked up the confidentiality agreement. Read it. Not skimmed, actually read it, clause by clause, while the room waited. It took 4 minutes. Vaughn shifted his weight once. The woman in the charcoal suit didn't move at all. When Clara finished, she set it back down on the desk. "He promised $1 million, she said. "Ms. Bennett, in front of witnesses, I didn't imagine that. The situation last night was Mr. Cross was under significant distress. A statement made in that context is still a statement," she said, "made in front of a room full of people who will all remember it exactly the same way." Vaughn's smile adjusted slightly at the edges. Less warmth, more calculation. "Ms. Bennett, I think you should consider that we can structure this conversation in several different ways. The payment we're offering is substantial and—" "I'm not signing this," Clara said. The room went quiet. "I want to be clear," she said, and she was aware that her voice was steady, in a way it had no real right to be given what was inside her chest right now, which was something between terror and absolute resolve. "I'm not doing this for money. I was not thinking about money when I helped him, but he made a promise. And my brother needs surgery that costs more than what's in that envelope. So I'm not signing something that prevents me from telling people what happened in exchange for an amount that doesn't cover what he said he'd pay." Vaughn looked at her for a long moment. "If you refuse to sign," he said carefully, "we may have to discuss the matter of your conduct last night. Unauthorized contact with a VIP guest. Interfering with a licensed physician. Richard." The voice came from the doorway. All 4 people in the room turned. Ethan Cross was standing in the entrance to Gerald's small office, still in the navy suit from the morning, looking at his own lawyer with an expression Clara had not seen on him before. A cold, specific displeasure that was distinct from anger. Anger was hot. This was not hot. Vaughn straightened. "Ethan, I know what you were doing." Ethan stepped into the room. It was not a large room, and his presence shrank it further. He looked at the folder on the desk, at the envelope, then at Clara. "I asked you to find out what she needed," he said to Vaughn with a quietness that was significantly worse than shouting. "Not to offer her a settlement. The agreement is standard procedure when—" "She's not being sued, Richard. I'm not in litigation. I had a medical emergency and she helped me." He paused. Every word was separated by a precision that was distinctly uncomfortable to be in the room with. "Get out." Vaughn opened his mouth. "Take your colleague and get out of this office." They left. The woman in the charcoal suit went without a word, which suggested she had better instincts than her employer. When the door closed, Ethan looked at Gerald, who immediately found something of great interest to look at on his whiteboard schedule. Then he looked at Clara. She was still standing in the center of the room with her arms at her sides and her face carefully neutral, doing the thing she did when something had shaken her more than she intended to show. "I didn't send them," he said. "I know." She said it before she'd fully decided if she believed it. Then, a second later, "I think I know. Vaughn operates on protocol. I told David to—" He stopped, rubbed the back of his neck with one hand, which was, she would realize later, the closest thing to a gesture of frustration she would ever see from him. "It wasn't what I intended." "What did you intend?" He looked at her steadily. "I intended to pay you what I said I'd pay you, and to talk about your brother." She studied his face. She was good at reading faces. She had spent years doing it, reading her mother's face when she was still alive and things were going wrong, but nobody said so. Reading Danny's face for the early signs of an episode, reading the faces of guests at expensive restaurants to gauge what they needed before they asked. She had developed, over time, a fairly reliable sense of when someone was performing sincerity and when they were just being sincere. Ethan Cross was not, in that moment, performing. "My brother's surgery costs $170,000 out of pocket," she said, "after insurance." "I know. David pulled the information." She stiffened. "He what?" "Medical financing databases. Insurance records are—" He stopped at her expression. "I know how that sounds. It sounds like a violation of my brother's privacy." "You're right." He said it without hedging. "It was efficient and it was wrong. I'll tell David not to do it again." She stared at him. "You're very strange," she said, which was not what she meant to say but came out anyway. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. "I've been told. I don't want him investigated. I don't want his records pulled. I told you what we needed because I chose to tell you. That's different." Understood. Is it? Yes. He met her eyes. I understand the difference between information that's given and information that's taken. I shouldn't have done it. It won't happen again. She held the look for another second, then exhaled. The surgery, she said. I'll fund it, the full amount. And if you're willing, I'd like to arrange a consultation with Dr. Yuen at Northwestern Memorial. He's the best laryngeal reconstruction specialist in the Midwest, maybe the country. He doesn't usually take new patients, but I can make a call. Clara was quiet for a moment. The amount he was offering, the surgeon he was offering, was not something she could produce from her own resources in any timeline that mattered for Danny. She was aware that. She was also aware of exactly what it felt like to be on the receiving end of a powerful person's generosity, and how easily that generosity could become a form of control if you weren't careful about the terms. What do you want in return? She asked. Nothing. That's not how this works. I know it's not how it usually works. He seemed to choose his next words with unusual care. I want to do it because I said I would, and because... He stopped. Started again, in the slightly rougher way people speak when they're saying something they mean and haven't rehearsed. Because you didn't have to come back this morning. You could have signed whatever Vaughn offered and walked away and nobody would have blamed you. The fact that you came back with a folder full of research... He paused. I'm trying to pay attention to what that means. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about Danny waking up at 2 and 4 in the morning with his throat closing. She thought about her folder on the kitchen table. She thought about nursing school and the professor who had told her she had good hands. You have the instinct for it, Ms. Bennett. You should finish. And she had finished 2 years later, and then she hadn't. I want the terms in writing, she said. Not a confidentiality agreement. A straightforward letter. The surgery funding, the referral to Dr. Yuen, the $1 million as agreed. No clauses about discretion, no restrictions on what I can say publicly. Ethan didn't hesitate. Fine. And I don't want to owe you anything afterward. This is a debt settled. We're even. Even, he agreed. She nodded. Something in her chest loosened by a fraction. Not relief exactly, but the particular release that comes when you've been braced for a fight and the fight doesn't happen the way you expected. One more thing, she said. He waited. Your medication. I wasn't kidding this morning. You need to see someone who isn't Holt. I can give you a name. There's a pulmonologist at UIC who published a study on laryngeal hyperreactivity in 2021. His name is Dr. Marcus Webb. She paused. Not the Marcus Webb who works for you. Something flickered in his eyes. That would have been confusing. The paper is in the folder I brought this morning. I left it with David. She paused again. You should read it. He looked at her with that expression she was beginning to recognize, the one she didn't have a name for yet, the one that was something between respect and something else that she wasn't ready to look at directly. Why? He said. Not challenging, genuinely asking. She thought about it honestly. Because you have a daughter, she said, and she needs you to be around. The silence that followed was different from the other silences in the room. It had a different weight. Ethan Cross looked at her for a long time, and then, very quietly, he said, How do you know about Mia? I don't. David mentioned you had a daughter last night when I asked him why you seemed so controlled during the episode, like you were trying not to scare someone. She held his gaze. Someone who wasn't in the room. He looked at the window. Outside, the city. The lake beyond it, flat and enormous and indifferent to everything happening in this small office. She's 8, he said. It came out the way things come out when someone says something true and bare without dressing it up. I know. Neither of them said anything for a moment. I'll read the paper, he said finally. Good. She picked up her jacket from the back of the chair where she'd draped it. She buttoned one button at the collar, a habit, her hands doing something while her mind settled. She was almost at the door when he spoke again. Miss Bennett. She turned. He was still looking at the window. My attorney was going to threaten your job. When he started talking about unauthorized contact, that was a threat. You should know that so you can prepare for it. She looked at the back of his head. Am I being fired? No. He turned then. But Vaughn plays a long game, and he doesn't like losing. He'll find another angle. She absorbed this. Is this your way of warning me? It's my way of being honest with you, since you seem to prefer it. She stood in the doorway for a second. Gerald's whiteboard, the fishing photo, the city outside and the shift she had in 3 hours, and the call she needed to make to Danny and the life that was waiting, complicated and unresolved, and hers, outside this building. "Mr. Cross," she said. He looked at her. "I've been dealing with systems that don't want to pay out for 8 months. Your lawyer is not the scariest thing I've faced this year." She left. She heard, just before the door swung closed behind her, something she hadn't expected. Not quite a laugh. More like the sound a person makes when something strikes them as true in a way they didn't anticipate. She walked through the building and out into the West Loop afternoon and called Danny from the corner of Randolph and Morgan, standing in the wind off the highway with her hand cupped around the phone. And she told him to call Dr. Ewan's office in the morning because there was going to be a referral. He was quiet for a long time. "Clara," he said finally, his voice rough in a way that had nothing to do with his throat. "Don't," she said, "don't do the thing." "I'm not doing a thing. You're about to do the thing where you cry, and then I have to act like I'm not about to cry. I'm not—" A pause. A sound that was definitely him not crying. "I'm just Clara." "I know," she said. "How did—" "I'll explain later. Go to sleep early tonight, okay? Use the positioning pillow." "I know how to use the positioning pillow." "I know you know." She hung up, stood on the corner for a moment. The wind was cold and real, and the city was loud and full of people going somewhere, and Clara Bennett stood in the middle of it and felt, for the first time in 8 months, something that was not exactly hope, but was close enough to it that the difference might not matter. She went home. She made dinner. She did not look at the folder on the kitchen table. She left it there, in the center of the table, in the place it had lived for 8 months. But for the first time, she left it closed. The footage appeared online at 6:14 in the morning, 3 days after the dinner at the Harlow Room. Someone had leaked it. Not the full security recording. Whoever did it was careful enough to clip it down to 47 seconds, just enough to show Ethan Cross at the table, the moment his body went wrong, the fall. And then a woman in a server's uniform moving through the frozen crowd with a purpose that made everyone else in the frame look like furniture. The clip ended just before Clara's hands made contact, just before the part that would have required explanation. It didn't need explanation. 47 seconds was enough. By 7 in the morning, it had 400,000 views. By 9, it had crossed 2 million. By noon, when Ethan's communications team had assembled in the 39th floor conference room with the specific energy of people who had not slept and were running on bad coffee and controlled panic, it was the third most watched clip on every major platform and the leading story on 3 financial news networks. The headline that did the most damage came from a financial blog that had, in Ethan's own private assessment, approximately 40,000 readers who were disproportionately the exact 40,000 people he needed to not read it. The headline read, "Cross-Tech CEO collapses at investor dinner. Source, he's been sick for months." The source was anonymous, the details were vague, but the specificity of months, not suddenly, not unexpectedly, but months, had landed in the financial community like a stone in still water, and the ripples were already visible in the pre-market numbers. Cross Technologies had opened down 4.5%. Ethan watched the number on the screen in his office. He was standing at the window again. The same posture Clara had found him in 2 mornings ago, one hand in his pocket, looking at the city. Except the city today felt like it was looking back. Marcus Webb came in without knocking, which was his privilege and his habit during crises. He set a tablet on Ethan's desk showing a scrolling feed of financial headlines. Morgenstern's people called at 7:30. Brenner sent an email at 8. Both are asking for a call before markets close. Set it up. The Kellerman Group has put a hold on the secondary agreement pending. I heard you. Ethan? Marcus stopped. Used the specific tone he only used when he had decided that professionalism required him to say something his employer did not want to hear. We need to talk about a statement, a real one, not the medical episode language from 3 days ago. Ethan turned from the window. People are speculating, Marcus said, and speculation is always worse than fact. Right now they're writing their own version of what's wrong with you, and I promise you their version is worse than yours. Ethan was quiet for a moment. He looked at the tablet, the headlines, the number that was still moving in the wrong direction. Get the team in here at 2, he said. Marcus nodded, already moving, then paused at the door. The server. The woman in the video. Her face is visible for about 6 seconds at the very end when the clip cuts. People are already trying to identify her. Ethan's jaw tightened. How close are they? A few hours, maybe. Someone's already posted that she works at the Meridian. Make sure she knows, Ethan said. Tell David to call her. Clara found out at 10:17 when her phone rang with a number she'd saved under David Chen, Crosstech, after their first conversation. It's out, David said. He had the clipped, information-dense phone manner of someone who spent most of his day managing crises on behalf of someone else. A clip from the Harlow room. You're in it. She was at the laundromat 3 blocks from her apartment, sitting on a plastic chair watching her work shirts rotate. She pulled up the clip on her phone with one hand. Watched it. Watched herself. The way she moved through the room, which she'd never seen from the outside before. It was strange and slightly disorienting, like hearing a recording of your own voice. The woman on the screen looked more certain than Clara remembered feeling. How bad? She asked. Your face is visible at the end. People will figure out who you are by this afternoon. She looked at her shirts rotating. What do you need from me? Nothing. Mr. Cross wanted you to know before it happened, so you could prepare. She absorbed that. He was warning her again, the second time in 3 days. Tell him I appreciate it, she said. She hung up, looked at the clip once more. Then she called Danny. He'd already seen it. Of course he had. Danny, who couldn't work right now and spent most of his daylight hours on his phone or his laptop, had eyes on everything. That's you, he said, without preamble. That's me. You look like you know exactly what you're doing. I did know exactly what I was doing. Clara. His voice had the tone it got when he was working up to saying something she would resist. People are going to come looking. I know. Are you going to talk to them? She watched her shirts. Not yet. Not yet meaning I don't know what I'm doing yet, meaning I need to think. She paused. How's your throat this morning? Don't change the subject. How's your throat, Danny? A short silence. Better than yesterday? One small episode around 5, resolved on its own. Good, she exhaled. I'll call you tonight. She spent the rest of the morning thinking about what she knew and what she couldn't yet prove, and the distance between those two things, because she had not told Ethan everything. Not yet. There was a piece she was still turning over in her mind, examining from different angles, trying to determine if the shape she thought she saw was real, or if she was constructing a pattern out of fear and her own too specific knowledge. It had started with the paper she'd given him. Dr. Marcus Webb's, the other Marcus Webb, the researcher, not the VP, 2021 study on laryngeal hyperreactivity and medication-induced progression. She knew that paper almost by heart. She had read it the first time 3 years ago when she was looking for answers about Danny's worsening condition, and she had read it again recently when the pattern of Ethan's attacks, as she'd reconstructed it from the timeline he'd mentioned during their conversation, had started striking her as wrong in a specific way. Not just wrong as in the medication isn't working. Wrong as in the medication is doing something it shouldn't be doing, in a way that requires deliberate, specific dosing to achieve. She was not a toxicologist. She was not a pharmacologist. She was a woman who had spent years in proximity to a very specific condition and who had, in the course of that time, developed a working knowledge of what organic progression looked like versus what managed progression looked like. Danny's condition had progressed organically. She knew what that felt like from the inside. Chaotic, unpredictable. The attacks scattered in frequency and intensity without pattern. Some months worse, some better. The whole thing governed by factors nobody fully understood, including stress and season and diet and 100 small variables. What she'd observed in Ethan, in the short timeline she had, which was admittedly limited, was different. The attacks were clustered. They had a rhythm. And that rhythm, when she mapped it against what he'd told her about his treatment schedule, correlated too precisely with his medication administration windows to be coincidental. She had written it out on a legal pad the night before, sitting at her kitchen table with the folder finally open again, this time to a fresh page. 2 columns. Treatment dates as Ethan had described them. Attack dates as he'd mentioned in passing during their conversations. The correlation was not perfect. Nothing in medicine was perfect. But it was there. It was consistent. and it pointed in a direction that made her stomach feel cold. She needed to be careful. She needed to be very, very careful because what she was considering was not medical negligence. It was not a doctor making a mistake. It was something worse than that. And if she said it out loud without sufficient evidence to back it up, she would look like exactly what powerful people's lawyers love to paint cautious women as: paranoid, overreaching, manufacturing drama to inflate her role in the story. She needed more. She arrived at Cross Technologies at 1:45. She had called David at noon and asked, with a directness she'd decided to just commit to at this point, whether she could attend the 2 o'clock meeting. There was a pause, and then David had said he'd ask, and then called back 7 minutes later and said yes. The conference room on the 39th floor had 12 people in it when she got there. Communications team, legal team, a different lawyer than Vaughn, a younger woman named Priya Anand, whom Clara immediately assessed as sharper and considerably less hostile, and Marcus Webb, the VP, who looked like a man who had been awake since the beginning of time. Ethan was at the head of the table. He looked at her when she came in. Not surprised. He'd known she was coming. Just looked in that direct, assessing way that she was learning was simply how he looked at everything. "Sit wherever," he said. She sat near the middle of the table, which put her between two communications people who both glanced at her with the slightly puzzled expression of people who couldn't quite categorize her presence. She was not, visibly, one of them. She was in the same dark jacket and black trousers from 2 days ago, which was the only professional outfit she owned, and she was aware of that. She focused on the meeting. The first 40 minutes were strategy. Marcus laid out the situation in clean, unhappy detail. The stock drop, the investor calls, the hold from the Kellerman Group, the media cycle that was at this point essentially riding its own momentum. The communications lead, a brisk woman named Sasha, presented 3 statement options ranging from minimal disclosure to full transparency, each with an associated risk analysis. The lawyers reviewed liability considerations. Everyone spoke with the professional fluency of people who did this for a living and were doing it well. And through all of it, Ethan sat at the head of the table and listened with the particular quality of attention he had. Not passive, not checked out, but visibly processing, integrating, the kind of listening that is also calculating. When Sasha finished the 3 options, he was quiet for a moment. "There's a 4th option," he said. Sasha looked up from her notes. "I tell them the truth," he said. The room did the specific kind of silence that happens when a group of professionals simultaneously processes that their most important client has just said something that violates every operating principle of their field. Marcus spoke first. "Ethan, not all of it. Not of the medication speculation. We're not there yet." He glanced at Clara when he said that briefly. A look that communicated, "I haven't forgotten. But the condition, the fact that I have a condition, the fact that I've had it for 2 years, the fact that it's manageable and I'm pursuing further treatment." He paused. "The truth about what's been happening, without the parts we don't know yet." Priya, the lawyer, said carefully, "That opens disclosure questions around the investor agreements." "I know. The timing, given the acquisition, I know." "Ethan," Marcus was using his tone again, "the market has already moved 4.5 points. If you go out there and confirm that you've been managing a chronic condition without disclosing it to investors, they'll be angry," Ethan said flatly. "Yes, and then they'll watch me handle it honestly, and they'll decide whether the company is more than one person's medical history." He looked at Marcus with a directness that ended the argument before it could fully start. "I'm not building this company on a lie that gets bigger every time someone clips another 47 seconds of security footage. We get ahead of it. Today." Another silence. Sasha was already writing something. Priya had her pen moving. Clara said nothing. She was watching Ethan Cross make a decision that was going to cost him something significant in the short term, and that he was making anyway, and she was trying to reconcile the man doing that with the man whose lawyer had tried to buy her silence with $50,000 4 days ago. She was finding that people were consistently more complicated than either their best or worst moments suggested. After the meeting broke up, and people drifted into smaller clusters of urgent, murmured planning, Ethan caught her eye from across the room, a slight inclination of his head toward the door. She followed him out into the corridor. He stopped near the window at the end of the hall, far enough from the conference room that their voices wouldn't carry. The city spread below them, indifferent and enormous, and she had noticed that he always seemed to orient himself toward windows when he needed to think, like he required a large visible distance to match whatever distance he was working through internally. "You wanted to say something in there," he said. She looked at him. "How did you know? You had the look of someone not saying something?" She filed that away, the fact that he was watching her closely enough to read that. She took a breath. "I need to ask you something about Holt, and I need you to answer it honestly, which I know is a strange thing to say to someone about their own doctor." "Ask. How did you find him? Originally?" Ethan's expression didn't change, but something behind it shifted slightly. "Through a network. Private referral system for high-profile clients who need medical discretion." "Who made the referral?" A pause. "My head of security at the time, a man named Pierce. He left the company about 18 months ago." "Why did he leave?" "We had a disagreement about protocol. He relocated to the East Coast." Ethan's voice was even, but there was something in it now, a very slight tightness, like a man who is following a thread he hasn't followed before and doesn't yet know where it leads. "Why are you asking about Pierce?" "I'm not sure yet," she said, which was honest. "Can I ask you about the medication itself? The specific compounds?" "I can get the full prescription record." "I'd like to see it. All of it. Every adjustment, every dosage change, for the full 2 years." He looked at her for a moment. "You think this is more than a prescribing error?" It wasn't a question. He was smart. She had known that from the beginning, had registered it in the way he processed things. And he had been sitting with this information for 4 days now, and he had arrived, she could see, at the edge of the same place she was standing. "I think," she said carefully, "that the pattern of your attacks is unusual, and I think the medication protocol has some specific features that I want a professional to review before I say anything more definitive." "What kind of professional?" "A toxicologist, or a clinical pharmacologist, someone who can look at the compound interactions and tell us whether the effects you've been experiencing are consistent with standard side effect profiles or whether they're consistent with something else." The word "something else" sat between them for a moment. Ethan Cross was very still. "That's a serious thing to suggest," he said quietly. "I know it is. I'm not suggesting it. I'm saying I want it ruled out." She held his gaze. "Do you know anyone who's had access to your medication, other than Holt?" He was quiet for a long time. "My household," he said finally. "Mrs. Osei, my housekeeper. My previous security lead, Pierce, before he left. He had full household access." A pause. "My assistant, various staff." "Pierce," she said. "He left 18 months ago. Your attack started 2 years ago." The stillness that came over Ethan's face in that moment was different from his ordinary stillness. It was the specific stillness of a person whose mind has just made a connection and is running its implications at speed, going very quiet on the outside while something very loud happens on the inside. "Pierce recommended Holt," he said. Very slowly. "Yes." "And the attack started shortly after Holt began treating me." "Yes." He turned to the window. She let him have the silence. Outside, Chicago was going about its business. The lake flat and gray under a thin November sky, the traffic on the expressway moving in its steady mechanical pulse, the world completely unconcerned with the conversation happening 39 floors above it. "I need the prescription record," he said. "I know, and I need the name of your toxicologist. I don't have one, but I know how to find one. Give me 24 hours. He turned back from the window. His jaw was set in a way she recognized. Not anger exactly, but the expression of a man who has just reoriented his entire understanding of a situation and is now recalculating from a new position. "You came to the office today to tell me this," he said. "I came because you invited me to the meeting, but yes, this was the conversation I needed to have. You could have led with it." "I didn't have enough yet to lead with. I still don't." She paused. "I have a pattern and a hypothesis." "That's not the same as evidence." He looked at her. "Most people would have gone to the press with a lot less." "I'm not most people," she said. She'd said it before. It landed differently this time. Not as a deflection, but as something she meant specifically. Something moved across his face. She had seen that expression before. In the restaurant, on the floor, the first time he'd looked at her with any real attention. It was, she had decided, the expression of a man who was genuinely surprised by something and was not accustomed to the feeling. She left the building at 4:15. The afternoon had turned cold, the kind of Chicago cold that arrived in early November like a creditor who'd been patient all summer and was done being reasonable. She walked 2 blocks to the nearest coffee shop, ordered the cheapest thing on the menu, and sat at a corner table and spent an hour on her phone identifying clinical pharmacologists in the Chicago area who published research on drug interaction profiles. She found 3 names. The most relevant was a Dr. Angela Reyes at the University of Illinois at Chicago. She had published extensively on neurological medication side effects and had specific research on laryngeal system pharmacology that was, as far as Clara could tell, exactly the expertise she needed. She sent a cold email from her personal account, attaching 2 of the papers from her folder and a brief, carefully written explanation of what she was looking at. She did not mention Ethan Cross by name. She did not mention any names. She described it as a hypothetical case she was consulting on behalf of a patient. That evening, she called Danny again. "I saw the press conference," he said, before she could speak. Because of course he had. Ethan Cross had made a brief, direct statement at 4:45, standing at a podium in the lobby of Cross Technologies with no notes. He had confirmed that he had been managing a chronic airway condition for approximately 2 years. He had confirmed that the incident at the Harlow Room was related to that condition. He had said the condition was being reevaluated with new medical guidance and that he anticipated significant improvement in his management of it going forward. He had thanked, briefly but by name, Clara Bennett, a member of the Meridian Hotel staff, for her assistance during the incident. He had said the name clearly, directly, without the hedging language of a woman who was present or a staff member. He'd said Clara Bennett, and then he'd moved on, in a way that was somehow both a protection and an acknowledgement at once. By the time Clara's phone started ringing with numbers she didn't recognize, she was already back in her apartment in Logan Square, sitting on her couch with her shoes still on. She let them ring. "He named you," Danny said. "I heard." "You okay?" She thought about it honestly. "I'm processing." "Are you going to talk to any of them, the press?" "Not yet." She looked at the folder on the table, still closed. "There's something else happening. I don't want to say anything publicly until I know what it is." Danny was quiet for a moment. She could hear him thinking in the specific way she could always hear him thinking, the slight pause, the exhale. "How deep into this are you?" It was a real question, not a worried brother question, not a be careful question, a genuine, what is the actual situation question. That was Danny. He asked the thing directly when most people would have dressed it up. "I don't know yet," she said. "Deeper than I planned." "Do you trust him?" She looked at the window, the city outside. "I trust that he's not pretending to take this seriously." "That's not the same thing." "I know it's not." Another pause. "He named you in front of the whole country." "He did." "That's either something real," Danny said, "or it's the most expensive PR move anyone's ever made." "I'm aware of both options." "Which do you think it is?" She thought about Ethan at the window, the way he'd said she's 8, stripped of everything, the way he told her about Pierce without being asked again, following the thread himself because he decided to follow it. "I think it might be both," she said, "at the same time, and I think he might not even know which." The next morning, Dr. Angela Reyes replied to her email. The reply was 3 paragraphs long, professionally worded, and contained at the end a cell phone number with a note that said, "Call me. This is worth discussing in person." Clara sat at her kitchen table and read the email 3 times. Then she called the number. Dr. Reyes picked up on the second ring. She was in her late 40s, Clara guessed from her voice. Direct, fast-moving, the tone of someone who talked to a lot of people who didn't understand what they were looking at and had developed patience for it without losing precision. "The compounds you described," Reyes said, without much preamble. "Specifically, the combination of the third-line agent with the baseline suppressant. Walk me through the dosage schedule again." Clara walked her through it. Reyes asked 3 clarifying questions. Clara answered them. Silence. "Okay," Reyes said finally. "I need to say something to you clearly. This is preliminary, and it is not a diagnosis, and it is not evidentiary. You understand that?" "Yes." "The interaction you're describing, the specific combination, at the dosing intervals you've outlined, would not produce these effects accidentally. A physician prescribing those compounds in that combination, at those intervals, would have to either not know what they were doing, which for a trained pulmonologist is essentially impossible, or they knew exactly what they were doing, Clara said quietly. A beat of silence. You need to document everything, Reyes said. Every prescription record, every dosage log, every administration date you can reconstruct. And you need a lawyer before you go any further with this. I know. Does the patient know? Clara looked at her legal pad on the table. The 2 columns, treatment dates, attack dates, the correlation that had kept her awake for 3 nights running. He's starting to understand it, she said. When she met Ethan Cross at Cross Technologies that afternoon and laid the legal pad on the desk between them, she watched his face go through something she had not seen it go through before. Not shock exactly. Ethan Cross did not do shock in any visible way. More like the specific expression of a man receiving confirmation of something he had, on some deep and unexamined level, already begun to believe but had needed to hear from the outside before he could accept it. He looked at the 2 columns for a long time. Holt, he said, we still need a full toxicological analysis of the compounds themselves. Dr. Reyes is willing to consult, but... She stopped. Started again. This isn't a prescription error, Ethan. The dosing intervals are too specific. The compound combination is too specific. He was quiet for a long time. Someone told him to do this, he said. His voice was very level. The kind of level that was its own form of danger. That's possible. Or he did it independently for his own reasons. She paused. Do you know of any reason someone in your professional circle would want to keep you sick? To keep you dependent on treatment? To keep you destabilized? He looked up from the legal pad. His eyes had the sharp, focused quality of a man running through a catalog of his own life and looking at it differently than he had before. The acquisition, he said slowly. She waited. The $6.2 billion deal, there are people who benefit if it doesn't close. If I'm perceived as too unstable to run the company, he stopped. If I collapse at the wrong moment, in front of the wrong people, he looked at the window. It almost worked. Brenner, she said, the German investor from the dinner, the one who had been sitting to his left. He looked at her sharply. Why Brenner? I don't know that it's Brenner. I don't know anything for certain, but he was the person closest to you when the attack started. And he was very composed for someone who had just watched the CEO of a company he's investing $6 billion in collapse on the floor. She paused. Most people were at least visibly shaken. He wasn't. Ethan Cross looked at her. You noticed all of that, he said. It wasn't quite a question. I notice things, she said. It's what I do. Another silence. The city outside. The lake. The 39 floors between them and the ground, and everything waiting on the ground. I need to call my attorney, he said. Not Vaughn. He said it in a way that made clear he did not mean Vaughn. Yes. And I need the prescription records pulled today. Everything Holt prescribed, every adjustment, every refill. I can help you organize them. He looked at her across the desk. There was something in his expression that she was becoming familiar with, in the way you become familiar with the specific light quality of a place you keep returning to. That particular combination of assessment and something warmer, something that neither of them had named and that she was not yet ready to examine directly. Why are you doing this? He said. She had been waiting for the question. She had been rehearsing the answer, trying to find the version that was true without being more than she was ready to say. Because you have a daughter, she said, which was the same thing she had said before, which was true. But it was not the only true thing. He held her gaze for a moment, and she thought he knew that. She thought he was precise enough, and attentive enough, and honest enough, when it cost him something, to know that it was not the only true thing. But he didn't push. Instead, he reached across the desk and picked up the legal pad and looked at it again, and something about the set of his shoulders changed. Not softer, not warmer, but differently arranged. Like a man who has been holding a weight in the wrong position for a long time and has just found a slightly better way to carry it. She stayed for 3 more hours that afternoon. They went through the prescription records together. David produced them within 45 minutes, which spoke to either excellent filing or the specific efficiency of an assistant who had learned that his employer's requests were not casual. Clara cross-referenced them against the timeline on the legal pad. Reyes called back at 5 with 2 preliminary findings that Clara transcribed carefully in her own handwriting in the second column, next to dates and doses. Outside, the city went dark in its efficient way. The lights of the skyline came up. The lake disappeared into the night. At 6:15, Ethan looked up from the documents and said, "Have you eaten?" She looked up. "What?" "Today. Have you eaten today?" She thought about it. "Coffee, this morning." He was already picking up his phone. "I'll have David order something." You've been here for 3 hours and you're running on coffee, and you found out someone has potentially been trying to kill me, and I think under those circumstances, ordering dinner is a reasonable—" He stopped. There was a very slight tension around his mouth that was his version of embarrassed. She was starting to understand. "I just think you should eat," he said, more simply. She looked at him. He looked back. "Okay," she said. David ordered Thai food, which arrived 20 minutes later, and which they ate at the conference table with the prescription record spread between them like a map of a territory neither of them had known they were navigating until now. They did not talk about anything significant while they ate. He asked her once how Danny was doing, and she told him, "Better. The positioning pillow was helping. The pre-consultation with Ewan's office was scheduled for next week." He nodded. She asked him how Mia handled the day's press conference, and he said she had watched it at Mrs. O'Sea's apartment and texted him afterward, "You look nervous. Were you nervous?" And he had texted back, "A little." And she had sent back, "Good. That means it was real." Clara laughed at that. Not a polite laugh, a real one, short and genuine, the kind that surprised her on the way out. She watched him register it, watched something shift in his face at the sound of it, something that was there and then gone, quickly enough that she almost missed it. Almost. She left at 7:30. He walked her to the elevator, which she suspected was not something he did often. They stood in the corridor for a moment before the doors opened. "Tomorrow," he said. "I'm meeting with the legal team. The real one. Not Vaughn. I want you there." "I'm not a lawyer." "You found this," he said simply. "I want you there." The elevator opened. "Okay," she said, for the second time that evening. She rode down alone. The lobby was nearly empty at this hour. The security desk staffed by the overnight rotation, the enormous space quiet and lit with its expensive understated light. She pushed through the glass doors and out into the Chicago night, cold and clear and smelling like the lake. She walked to the train station 2 blocks away. She bought her fare and waited on the platform and watched the lights of the train approaching through the dark tunnel. And she thought about what Dr. Reyes had said on the phone that morning. The interaction you're describing would not produce these effects accidentally. She thought about Holt and Pierce and the acquisition, and Brenner sitting composed while a man turned blue on the floor. She thought about a pattern written in 2 columns on a legal pad. She thought about the specific way someone had arranged the pieces of Ethan Cross's medical care so that he would stay sick just enough, just often enough to be manageable, to be controllable, to be, at the critical moment, in front of the right 12 people, a man who could not hold his own room. The train came. She got on. The doors closed behind her. She watched her own reflection in the dark window across the car. A woman in a gray blouse and a dark jacket with a messenger bag over her shoulder and the slight accumulated weariness of someone who had been running on purpose and coffee for 4 days. She didn't look like someone in the middle of something. She looked like someone on the train home after a long day. She thought about that, about how most of what happened to people looked from the outside like nothing. And then she thought about tomorrow, the legal team, the toxicology results that Reyes was beginning to formalize, the moment coming. She could feel it coming the way you feel weather before you can see it, when what she knew would need to be said out loud in a room full of people who had the power to do something about it. She was ready. She was also, if she was honest, scared. Both of those things were true at the same time, and she had long since learned that the two existing simultaneously was not a contradiction. It was just how real things felt. The train moved through the dark city, carrying her home. Dr. Angela Reyes delivered her preliminary findings on a Thursday morning, 11 days after the dinner at the Harlow Room. She came in person, which Clara had not expected. She had anticipated an email, maybe a call, a careful, professionally hedged document that she could take to the lawyers and let them argue about. Instead, Reyes showed up at Cross Technologies at 9 in the morning, carrying a leather satchel and the expression of a woman who had spent a week looking at something that made her angry and had decided that anger was worth communicating in person. She was compact and dark-haired, mid-40s, with reading glasses pushed up on her head, and the specific no-nonsense quality of academics who had spent enough years in clinical settings to stop performing patients they didn't feel. She shook Clara's hand in the lobby with a grip that meant business, shook Ethan's hand the same way, and then sat down in the conference room and opened her satchel and put a 32-page document on the table. "I'm going to be direct," she said, to the room generally, which also contained Priya Anand, a senior litigation attorney named James Kowalski, who Ethan had brought in specifically for this, and Marcus Webb, who was there because someone needed to manage whatever came out of this meeting, and Marcus had, at this point, the institutional stamina of a person who had already survived the worst week of his professional life and had simply kept going. "The compound combination prescribed by Dr. Raymond Holt," Reyes continued, "is not a recognized treatment protocol for laryngeal hyperreactivity disorder, not in any clinical literature, not in any standard of care guideline." She flipped to the second page of her document. "The primary agent, which Holt described to the patient as an anti-inflammatory, has documented properties as a laryngeal tissue sensitizer when administered at the intervals recorded in the prescription log. What that means in plain language is that this medication, at this dosage, given this frequently, would progressively increase the severity and frequency of laryngeal spasm events over time, not decrease them. Increase them." The room was very quiet. Kowalski said, "Is it possible this was a prescribing error, a misreading of the literature?" Reyes looked at him with the expression of a woman who had anticipated this question and found it insufficient. "The compound interaction I'm describing is not obscure. It's not buried in a footnote. Any pulmonologist practicing at Holt's level would encounter this literature in their basic training." She paused. "What Holt prescribed is not what a confused doctor prescribes. It's what a doctor prescribes when they want a specific outcome." Ethan was sitting at the head of the table. He had been still since Reyes started speaking. The specific, contained stillness she had come to understand was how he processed things that hit him hard. He had his hands flat on the table. His face was neutral in the deliberate way that meant it was costing him something to keep it that way. "What outcome?" he said. It wasn't a question. "Ongoing dependency," Reyes said. "Chronic, escalating episodes. A patient who is never well enough to function without treatment, but never sick enough to seek a second opinion." She paused. "A patient who is, at any given moment, approximately one missed dose, or one deliberate double dose, away from a severe, potentially fatal episode." The silence that followed that sentence was the kind that changes the temperature of a room. Clara had known this was coming. She had spent 11 days building toward this moment, reading Reyes's preliminary notes, reconstructing the timeline, cross-referencing the research. She had known, intellectually, what the findings were going to say, but hearing it stated that plainly, a patient who is approximately one missed dose away from a potentially fatal episode, landed differently than knowing it. It had weight. It had the specific gravity of something that had already happened and could have ended badly and by pure accident of circumstance did not. She looked at Ethan. He was looking at the document on the table. His jaw was tight. Something was moving behind his eyes that she recognized, distantly, as the expression of a person doing a very fast and very painful recalculation, going back through 2 years of his own life and looking at every attack, every bad night, every morning he'd woken up counting his breaths and understanding it differently. "Pierce recommended Holt," he said, mostly to himself. The same words he'd said to her at the window 11 days ago, but this time with a weight that hadn't been there before. "We need to establish the chain," Kowalski said. He had a yellow legal pad and had been writing since Reyes sat down, in the fast, abbreviated script of a man thinking faster than his hand. "Holt to Pierce, Pierce to whoever directed this. That's where liability—" "I know where the liability is," Ethan said quietly. "I'm thinking about something else right now." Kowalski stopped writing. Ethan looked up from the document. He looked at Reyes first. "Thank you for doing this quickly." Reyes nodded once. I have colleagues who should review this independently. 2 other pharmacologists I trust. I'd recommend letting me bring them in before any legal action. Do it. She looked at Clara next, briefly, with an expression that communicated something that didn't need words. The particular acknowledgement one professional extends to another when the amateur turned out to be right and the professionals turned out to be slow. Then she looked back at Ethan. Stop all medication from Holt's protocol immediately. You've already stopped most of it? 10 days ago. And your episode since? He paused. 1, minor, 4 days ago. Reyes nodded slowly. That's consistent with the withdrawal and recalibration timeline. It should continue to improve. She closed her satchel. Your underlying condition is real. I want to be clear about that. The laryngeal hyperreactivity exists independently of the medication manipulation, but it is significantly more manageable than what you've been experiencing. You've been fighting 2 problems simultaneously while only knowing about one. Ethan absorbed this. What's the treatment? There are 3 current protocols that are actually appropriate for your presentation. I can connect you with Dr. Yuen. I understand you're already in contact with his office, and my recommendation aligns with his specialty. She paused. You're going to be fine. That's not a thing I say to make people feel better. It's a medical assessment. Something in Ethan's posture changed very slightly. Not visible to most people, Clara suspected, but she had spent enough time watching him now to notice the micro-adjustments. The way his shoulders settled a fraction of an inch lower, the way he exhaled through his nose. She thought about Mia and the text message. That means it was real. After Reyes left, the legal meeting went for 2.5 hours. Kowalski was thorough in the particular way that good litigation attorneys were thorough, building the case from the ground up, asking questions that seemed basic until you understood they were structural. He wanted everything documented. Ethan's original introduction to Pierce, the timeline of Pierce's departure from the company, the referral chain to Holt, the prescription records, Reyes's findings, and the one thread that was still loose and fraying, Brenner. Ethan had not said the name to Kowalski. He had not said it to anyone except Clara, but Kowalski was good enough to find the thread himself. The Harlow Room dinner, he said, reading from his notes. Tell me again about the guest arrangements. Who proposed that format? Who confirmed the attendee list? Marcus looked up. The format was standard for that tier of investor event. The attendee list was confirmed through my office, and he stopped. Something crossed his face. It went through the secondary confirmation channel, which is managed by... He stopped again. Who? Ethan said. Marcus looked like a man who did not want to say what he was about to say. The confirmation was routed through Pierce's old liaison contact. Before Pierce left the company, he set up several automated systems and communication channels. A few of them are still active because nobody flagged them for deactivation. He paused. Including the one that was used to confirm the attendee list for the Harlow Room dinner. The room absorbed this. So someone, Kowalski said carefully, with access to Pierce's old systems could have known the dinner format in advance, known who would be there, known the seating arrangement. Brenner was to my left, Ethan said flatly. And was closest to you when the episode began, Clara said. She had not intended to speak, but the connection was sitting right there on the table between all of them, and she was tired of watching people approach it sideways. Kowalski looked at her. It was the first time he'd really looked at her directly during the meeting, and she could see him doing the recalibration that most people did when they'd been ignoring her and then realized they shouldn't have been. You think Brenner was waiting for it to happen? I think it's worth asking whether the dinner was arranged in a way that positioned a specific person near Ethan at the moment. A specific medication adjustment would be likely to produce an episode. She paused. I think it's worth asking what Brenner's position would be if the acquisition failed, what he stood to gain from a failed deal. Marcus was already pulling something up on his tablet. Brenner has a secondary position in Kellerman Group, the company that put the acquisition hold on after the... He looked up. If the Crosstech acquisition fails, Kellerman's competing infrastructure deal moves forward. Brenner is one of 4 major investors in Kellerman's competing deal. The silence this time was different. It had a shape. Ethan Cross said nothing for a long moment. He was looking at the table. Then he looked at Kowalski. How long to build a case? Months, Kowalski said honestly. If we go through proper channels, Pierce is on the East Coast, but he's findable. Holt's medical records can be subpoenaed. Brenner is harder. He's German national. He has international legal protections, and the connection between him and Holt is currently circumstantial. He paused. But the circumstantial case is strong, and Holt, when he understands the exposure he's carrying, may decide that cooperation is in his interest. Make him understand that, Ethan said. Kowalski wrote something on his legal pad. He wrote it with the particular satisfaction of a man given a clear instruction that aligns precisely with what he was already planning to do. After the legal team left, Marcus stayed behind. He and Ethan had a conversation that Clara was not part of. She waited in the corridor, checking her phone, giving them the room. Through the glass, she could see Marcus talking with his hands in the way he did when he was arguing something he felt strongly about, and Ethan listening with the slightly closed expression he wore when he'd already decided something and was letting someone else reach the conclusion. When Marcus came out, he looked at Clara with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not the frantic but functional crisis energy she'd seen all week. Something more direct, more personal. "You were right about all of it," he said. It clearly cost him something to say. Marcus Webb was a man who operated in the controlled language of investor relations and did not deliver unsolicited verdicts. "I should have. When Ethan first had the attacks, I noticed something was off with the treatment timeline. I didn't say anything." "Why not?" He looked slightly ashamed. "Because Holt had credentials and I didn't, because it wasn't my place." He paused. "Because it was easier not to." She looked at him. "You know now. That's what matters." He nodded. It was a real nod, not a professional one. She went back into the conference room. Ethan was still at the table, the document spread in front of him, but he wasn't reading it. He was looking at the window. "What did Marcus want?" she asked. "To make sure I knew that he'd had doubts about Holt for about a year and hadn't said anything." Ethan paused. "He thought I needed to know." "Do you hold that against him?" "No." He said it without hesitation. "People don't say the hard thing all the time. I know that better than anyone." A beat. "I didn't tell anyone about the attacks for 2 years. I'm not in a position to be angry at someone else for staying quiet." She sat down across from him, the document between them, the city outside, the quiet of a room that had been through something significant and was now on the other side of it. "What happens now?" she asked. "Kowalski files preliminary legal action against Holt. Medical board complaint concurrent with civil suit. Pierce gets located and deposed. Brenner," he paused. "Brenner gets handled through a different mechanism, publicly." "What does that mean?" "It means his position in the Kellerman deal becomes known to every investor in both transactions. It means the conflict of interest gets laid out somewhere that cannot be ignored." He looked at her. "The acquisition is still on the table. The Morgan Stern Group confirmed yesterday. The Kellerman hold is being reviewed by their own compliance team because Brenner's conflict puts them in a liability position they don't want." He paused. "The company is going to be okay." "Good," she said. She meant it simply. He looked at her. Something had been building in his expression for the last hour. Not the calculating assessment of the early days, not the cautious, grateful look from the conference room, but something more unguarded than either of those. Something that made her slightly uncomfortable in a way she couldn't easily categorize. "There's something I want to do," he said, "and I want to do it properly, which means I need to ask you first." She waited. "The board meeting is next Tuesday. The full board, 31 members, most of the executive team, the legal and communications leads. I'm going to make a full statement about everything, the medical situation, the investigation into Holt, the acquisition status." He paused. "I want you there." She blinked. "In what capacity?" "As the person who found this." He said it simply. "You spent 11 days building a case from a legal pad and a cold email to a pharmacologist you'd never met. That deserves to be acknowledged in the room where it matters." "Ethan." She stopped. It was the first time she'd used his first name without the slight formality of distance, and she noticed it, and she thought he noticed it too. "I don't need to be in a boardroom." "I know you don't need to be. I'm asking if you're willing to." She looked at him. She thought about the conversation she'd had with herself 11 days ago on the train home about being ready and scared at the same time. She thought about her folder on the kitchen table. She thought about Danny's pre-consultation with Ewan's office, which had happened yesterday. A phone call that had left her brother quieter than she'd heard him in months. Not sad quiet, but the quiet of someone who has just been told that the thing they stopped letting themselves hope for might actually happen. "Okay," she said. He nodded, then reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and placed an envelope on the table. She looked at it. "The transfer was made this morning," he said. "To the account David confirmed with you. $1 million. He paused. "Danny's surgery costs are separately arranged. Direct to the facility, prepaid. The consultation with Ewan is confirmed for next Thursday." She looked at the envelope. She knew it was probably a confirmation letter or a transaction summary. Nothing she needed to open right now, nothing dramatic. Just paper representing something that had already happened in a bank somewhere, numbers moving from one place to another in the way that money moved, invisibly and irrevocably. She had told herself, in the early days of all this, that she would feel relief when this moment came. Clean, simple relief. The number on the folder on the kitchen table going away, Danny's surgery becoming possible and then certain. What she actually felt was more complicated than that. Relief was in there, yes, but it was layered over with everything else the last 11 days had been. The exhaustion and the fear and the specific disorienting experience of having her life change shape faster than she could process the change. The folder would come off the kitchen table. The weight that had been living in her chest for 8 months would start to lift. Danny would be okay. All of that was true and real. And somehow it coexisted with the strange, vertiginous feeling of standing at the end of something and the beginning of something else simultaneously, without a clear view of either. "Thank you," she said. The words were small for what they carried. "Don't thank me," he said. "I made a promise. And then you gave me about 11 reasons to keep it." She looked at him across the table, the document, the envelope, the window, and the city beyond it. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes. When you were on the floor, that night." She paused. "Before I got to you, what were you thinking about?" He was quiet for a moment. She thought he might deflect. He was very good at deflecting when questions got close to something real, but he didn't. "Mia," he said, "I was thinking that she was at Mrs. Osei's apartment eating jollof rice, and she didn't know anything was wrong, and I needed to make sure it stayed that way." He paused. "That's all I was thinking. Just stay conscious long enough that she doesn't have to find out this way." Clara looked at him. She felt the thing she'd been feeling around the edges of for 11 days. The thing she'd been carefully not looking at directly. Press a little closer. She looked away. "You should go home early tonight," she said. "See her. I'm meeting with Kowalski again at 6. Cancel it. Or reschedule." She picked up her bag. "Kowalski can send you notes. Mia can't." He looked at her with that expression she didn't have a name for. "Is that an instruction?" he said. There was something in his voice that wasn't quite amusement, something lighter than the week had been. "It's a strong suggestion," she said, "from someone who doesn't work for you." He was quiet for a moment. "You're right about that. You definitely don't work for me." "No," she said, "I don't." She left the building and called Danny from the corner of Randolph and Morgan, standing in the same spot she'd stood 11 days ago in the same wind. Some things had changed in those 11 days in ways that were large and fundamental and still settling. Others were exactly the same. The corner, the wind, the train 2 blocks away, her voice saying her brother's name into a phone. "The surgery is confirmed," she said when he answered. "The facility is paid. Ewan's office called?" "They called," he said. His voice was rough. "Clara, I know." "How are you doing?" The question landed differently than she expected. She had been so focused outward, on Ethan, on Holt, on the documents and the meetings and the legal timelines, that she hadn't stopped to ask herself the question Danny was asking. "I think I'm okay," she said. "I'm going to be okay." "That's not the same as okay right now." "No," she admitted. "It's not." "What do you need?" She laughed a little, a small, tired laugh. "I think I need to sleep, and I think I need to call Mom's sister in Cleveland and tell her you're getting the surgery." She paused. "And I think I might need to eat an actual meal that isn't Thai food from a corporate cafeteria." Danny made the sound that was his laugh. "Come over tomorrow. I'll make the thing with the pasta. The carbonara. The carbonara. You're not supposed to. My throat is fine for carbonara. Dr. Ewan hasn't told me not to make carbonara. Dr. Ewan hasn't met your carbonara. My carbonara is therapeutic, Danny said with dignity. She smiled, standing on the corner in the cold, with the wind off the highway and the city doing its thing around her. She smiled in the real way, the unguarded way, the way that didn't happen as often as it should. I'll be there at 7, she said. She went back to the Meridian that evening for the first time since the night of the dinner. Not for a shift. Gerald had given her the week, which was either compassion or the institutional recognition that having a staff member become a news story made scheduling complicated. She went because she'd left a book in her locker and because, if she was honest, she needed to return to something ordinary. Something that was just itself, without layers. The Harlow room was dark when she passed it. The door open, the lights off, the room in its in-between state. Neither the spectacular machinery of a service event nor the reset of a morning before staff arrived, but the genuine neutral of a space that was simply a room when no one was performing in it. She stood in the doorway for a moment. She had thought, in the days since, about the 47 seconds of security footage, about herself moving through the frame with that purpose that apparently looked, to the outside, like certainty. She didn't remember feeling certain. She remembered feeling like someone had simplified everything down to a single fact. There's a problem, I know how to address it. And that simplification had cleared everything else out of the way. She remembered his eyes when they'd focused. Dark and still slightly unfocused. Looking at her. She had looked back. That part she remembered very clearly. She got her book from her locker and was putting on her coat when Gerald appeared in the corridor, doing his usual rounds with the clipboard and the eyebrow language. He stopped when he saw her. "Bennett," he said, "just getting my book." He looked at her for a moment. 19 years of watching people in rooms had given him a very accurate internal calibration, and whatever he was reading off of her right now seemed to satisfy whatever question he was silently asking. "Your job is still here," he said, "when you want it." She nodded. "Thank you, Gerald." He started to walk away, then stopped, turned back. This was unusual. Gerald did not turn back. Gerald proceeded. "For what it's worth," he said, without quite meeting her eyes, which was also unusual. "What you did that night, in 30 years of hospitality, I've seen a lot of people handle pressure badly." He paused. He was clearly choosing words carefully, which was the most effort she'd ever seen him spend on language. "I've seen very few handle it the way you did." He walked away before she could respond, which she understood was deliberate. She stood in the corridor with her book under her arm and let that sit for a moment. Then she went home. The board meeting was on a Tuesday, gray and cold in the way that late November in Chicago was always gray and cold. A sky the color of old concrete, the lake invisible beneath its own mist. The kind of morning that suggested the city had been this way forever and would be this way until the end of things. Clara took the train downtown. She had bought a second professional outfit, charcoal trousers, a white blouse, a blazer she had found at a consignment shop in Wicker Park that fit well and cost $40. She looked, she thought, like someone who was supposed to be somewhere, which was, she had decided, sufficient. David met her in the lobby. He had, over the past 2 weeks, gradually dropped the slightly dazed quality of their first interactions and arrived at something more functional. A working relationship that operated on mutual efficiency and the shared understanding that they were both, in different ways, trying to make sure the same person didn't fall apart. "He's already in there," David said, walking her to the elevator. They started the preliminary items at 8. "He'll do the main statement at 9. "How is he?" David considered this with unusual honesty. "He slept last night, which is the first time in a while." He paused. "He took your advice about going home early. He had dinner with his daughter." Something warm moved through Clara's chest. "Good. She made him watch a documentary about deep-sea creatures," David added. "He texted me about it at 10:30. Apparently there's a fish called a barrel eye that has a transparent head." "There is," Clara said. David glanced at her sideways. "You knew that?" "Danny used to make me watch ocean documentaries when he was in the hospital. Said they made everything else seem smaller." David was quiet for a moment. "Smart kid." "Yeah," she said. "He is." The boardroom was on the 40th floor, and it was, like everything in this building, designed to be functional while also communicating that everything happening here was significant. 31 board members. The executive team, Priya and Kowalski, and 2 other legal staff. Marcus Webb, who had a coffee in each hand, and the expression of someone who had decided that today he was going to be calm if it killed him. Ethan was at the head of the table. He was in the dark navy again. Not the same suit, but the same palette, which Clara had noticed was his default under pressure. He saw her when she came in, and something in his posture shifted slightly. The way it shifted when a person registers the presence of someone they were waiting for without knowing they were waiting. She found a seat along the wall, not at the table. She was not a board member, not an executive. She was there as a witness, and she understood the difference, and she sat with her hands in her lap and watched. Ethan Cross addressed his board for 47 minutes. He told them everything, not in the hedged, carefully managed language of corporate disclosure, in the direct, unadorned way of someone who had made a decision about what honesty required and was carrying it out. He told them about the condition. He told them about Holt. He told them about the 2-year timeline. He told them about Dr. Reyes and the findings and the legal action now in process. He told them about Pierce. He told them, carefully and with Kowalski's guidance flagging the legally sensitive parameters, about Brenner and the conflict of interest and the investigation into whether the Harlow Room dinner had been arranged with specific intent. He did not perform emotion. He did not ask for sympathy. He stated facts with the precision of a man who believed that facts, clearly stated, were the only adequate response to the situation he was in. And then he said, "The person who identified this problem and built the initial case that allowed us to understand what we were dealing with is here today. Her name is Clara Bennett. She is not a doctor. She is not an attorney. She is a woman who paid attention when everyone else was too overwhelmed to think clearly, and who came back the next morning with a folder of research instead of a lawyer. I want this board to know her name, and I want it in the record." 31 board members turned and looked at the woman sitting along the wall in a consignment shop blazer. Clara looked back at them, steadily. She did not smile, and she did not look away. After the meeting, in the corridor outside, one of the senior board members, a woman in her 60s named Eleanor Voss, who had been on the board since the company's 3rd year and who had, Clara understood from context, been one of the key votes on the original executive structure, stopped beside her. "Ms. Bennett," she said. She had the tone of someone who rarely felt the need to explain herself, but had decided this moment warranted it. "I've been in boardrooms for 40 years. I've watched a lot of people presented to this kind of room." She paused. "You handled that with more composure than most executives I know." Clara was not sure what to say to that. "I just sat in a chair," she said, which was honest. Voss's mouth curved slightly. "Yes," she said. "You'd be surprised how few people do that well." She walked away. Clara watched her go. Down the corridor, Ethan was with Kowalski and 2 board members, talking with the focused intensity of a man who had spent 47 minutes being honest and was now managing the consequences. He caught her eye across the space between them, a look that lasted about 2 seconds. She nodded. He nodded. It was not a dramatic exchange. It was the opposite of dramatic. 2 people, across a crowded corridor, confirming something that didn't need words. The lawyer spent the rest of the day in depositions and document reviews. Marcus spent it on investor calls. The communications team drafted the public statement that would go out the following morning. The real one, the full one, the one that told the truth about what had happened and what was being done about it. Clara spent it in a small conference room with Priya and a paralegal named Tom, going through the medication timeline one more time, putting it in the formal sequence that legal proceedings would require. It was detailed and slow and occasionally tedious. She found she didn't mind. She had spent 8 months doing detailed, slow, tedious things on behalf of her brother's medical situation, and she had learned that the tedious things were often exactly the ones that mattered most. At 4 in the afternoon, Priya looked up from her laptop and said, "You were in nursing school before all this." 2 years, Clara said. "Are you going back?" Clara looked at the window, the gray November city, the lake invisible beyond its own mist. "I think so," she said. It was the first time she'd said it out loud, the first time the thought had moved from something she kept in a private corner of her mind to something she was willing to let be heard. Priya nodded. "Good," she said with a matter-of-factness that made it feel like a simple fact rather than encouragement, which Clara found she preferred. She was putting on her coat at 5:30, preparing to leave, when Ethan appeared in the doorway of the small conference room. He was alone, which was unusual. The building had not had an unscheduled moment in his day for 2 weeks. "How did it go in here, Sad?" he asked. "Well, the timeline is clean. Kowalski will be able to use it." He nodded. He came in and stood near the window, looking out in the way he did. She had mapped enough of his physical habits by now that she could read them the way you read weather. This one meant he had something to say and was locating the right words for it. She waited. "Mia wants to meet you," he said. Clara blinked. "She's known your name since the press conference. She looked you up. Apparently there's a profile piece that someone published that I haven't read yet, and she has, and she's been asking for 2 weeks when she can meet the nurse lady." He paused. "I told her you weren't a nurse yet." "You told an 8-year-old I wasn't a nurse yet." She's precise about things. He turned from the window. "She said yet implies it's going to happen." She seemed satisfied with that. Clara stared at him. "She sounds terrifying." Something moved across his face. Real amusement this time. Not the outline of it, but the actual thing. "She is, slightly. He said. "She gets it from her father." Clara felt the laugh before she could stop it. A real one again. The same way as before. Short and genuine and surprising on the way out. He watched it happen. The warmth was back in his expression. That thing that had been accumulating over 2 weeks, building in the spaces between conversations and documents and the Thai food and the corporate corridor silences. She had been not looking at it for long enough that looking at it directly now was a mild shock. Not unpleasant, just there. Real and unambiguous and requiring some kind of response that she wasn't ready to have words for. "I don't need to," she started. "I know you don't need to," he said. Familiar words. "I'm asking if you're willing." She looked at him for a moment. This man who was not warm in any of the easy ways, but who said please when he caught himself issuing orders, and who went home to eat dinner with his daughter when someone told him to, and who put her name on the record in front of 31 people because he believed it belonged there. "Tell her I like deep-sea documentaries," Clara said. He looked at her. "Why?" "David told me about the barrel-eye fish. Tell her I already know about those. She'll appreciate that I came prepared." The expression on his face in that moment, she thought about it later on the train home, in the particular private space of her own head where she let herself be honest about things she wasn't ready to be honest about in rooms. She thought about the specific quality of it, the way it moved, the way it settled. She didn't have a word for it yet. She thought she might, eventually. The train moved through the dark tunnel under the city. Outside, Chicago was entering its real winter, the kind that wasn't a prologue to something else but was fully itself. Cold and gray and completely alive. The kind of city that demanded you show up, that took what you couldn't handle and handed it back to you until you could. Clara Bennett sat on the train going home and felt, in her chest, the particular feeling of a life reorganizing itself around new facts. Her brother was getting his surgery in 3 weeks. She was going back to nursing school in January. And somewhere on the 40th floor of a glass tower in the West Loop, a man who had spent 2 years being quietly destroyed by the one person paid to help him was, for the first time, breathing without counting. She closed her eyes for 2 stops. Let the city carry her. That was enough for tonight. Danny's surgery was on a Wednesday morning in mid-December, when Chicago had finally committed to winter in the way it committed to things. Fully, without apology, the temperature sitting at 11 degrees and the wind off the lake making it feel like something considerably worse. Clara had been awake since 4. She hadn't set an alarm. Her body had simply decided that sleep was finished, the way it always did before something significant. Not anxiously, just with the particular alertness of a person whose nervous system had decided that this day required full presence from the beginning. She lay in the dark for a while, listening to the wind against the windows, and then she got up and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table. The folder was gone. She had taken it off the table 3 weeks ago, the morning after the board meeting, and filed it in the drawer where it belonged now that it was history rather than present tense. The table was just a table. She hadn't fully realized until it was gone how much space the folder had occupied, not physically, but in the way that things you can't fix occupy the inside of your head. the particular background hum of an unsolvable problem, running constantly beneath everything else. The table without this folder was very quiet. She drank her coffee and thought about Danny, asleep right now 3 miles away in his apartment on Fullerton, with the surgery intake papers on his own kitchen table and the preoperative diet he'd been complaining about for 2 weeks, and the specific, complicated bravery of a person who had spent 8 months being told that the thing he needed wasn't available and was now 24 hours from receiving it. She thought about the first time Danny had an episode. He was 11. She was 15. Their mother was still alive but already sick in the way that announced itself slowly. The tiredness, the weight loss, the appointments she went to alone and came home from without discussing. Clara had been in the kitchen doing homework when she heard the sound from the living room. Not a scream, not a gasp, just a silence that was wrong in a way she felt before she understood it. She had run in and found her brother on the couch with his hands at his throat and his face going pale, and she had not known what to do. She had absolutely not known what to do, and that helplessness had carved something permanent into her. She had spent the 15 years since filling that carving in, learning, preparing, building the knowledge base that turned helplessness into action, one paper and one hospital visit and one late-night conversation with a specialist at a time. She had never framed it to herself as strength. It was just the alternative to the thing she couldn't be. Her phone lit up at 5:15. A text from Ethan. "How are you doing?" Not a question mark. He had, she'd noticed, a habit of sending statements where other people sent questions, as if he wasn't sure he had the right to ask, but wanted to make the space available anyway. She looked at the text for a moment. "Awake," she typed back. "Couldn't sleep." His response came in less than a minute. "Same." Mia woke up at 3 asking about Danny's surgery. She wanted to know the specific procedure name so she could look it up. Clara felt the warmth in her chest that she'd stopped trying to contain approximately 2 weeks ago. "What did you tell her?" "I told her it was called a laryngeal reconstruction procedure. She went back to sleep and I assume she's currently dreaming about medical textbooks. She looked up barrel-eye fish before I even got there," Clara typed. She had 3 facts ready. "She had 7, Ethan corrected. "She held back 4 to see if you'd be impressed by the first 3. Clara laughed. Alone in her kitchen at 5:15 in the morning, coffee going cold in her hands, she laughed the real laugh, the short, unguarded one, at a text message. She was aware of what that meant. She had been aware of it for a while. "Tell her Danny says thank you for the card," she typed, because Mia had sent Danny a card 2 weeks ago, a handmade one, which David had delivered on her behalf, with a drawing of a human throat anatomy diagram that was either impressive or alarming, depending on how you felt about 8-year-olds with detailed medical knowledge, and the words, "You're going to be fine." That's a fact, not a feeling, written in careful block letters. Danny had put it on his refrigerator. "She'll want a full report," Ethan replied. "She has follow-up questions. Tell her I'll give her one." She put the phone down and finished her coffee and got ready to go be with her brother. The surgery took 6 hours and 14 minutes. Clara knew the exact time because she was watching the clock on the wall of the surgical waiting room at Northwestern Memorial with the specific, involuntary attention of a person who cannot read or focus on anything else. She had brought a book. She had opened it twice and read the same paragraph both times without retaining a single word. The waiting room had a television mounted in the corner showing a morning news program on mute, the closed captions running slightly behind the anchors' mouths. There was a man across from her who was asleep sitting upright, which Clara envied deeply. There was a woman 2 seats down who was knitting something red with the focused efficiency of someone who had learned through practice to redirect anxiety into production. Clara sat with her hands in her lap and waited. At 4 hours and 20 minutes, her phone buzzed with a text from Ethan. No words, just a photo. Mia, apparently at school based on the background, holding a handwritten sign that said, "Danny's got this," in large red letters with what appeared to be a small, scientifically accurate drawing of a larynx in the corner. Clara stared at the photo for a long time. Then she pressed the phone against her sternum and looked at the ceiling and breathed very carefully in the way you do when you are in a public space, and crying is not something you are willing to do publicly. The surgeon, Dr. Ewan himself, came out at 6 hours and 14 minutes. He was compact and unhurried, with the specific quality of stillness that belonged to people who spent their days doing extremely precise things with their hands and had learned to turn the rest of the world down very low. Miss Bennet, he said. She stood up so fast she knocked her book off the chair. The procedure was successful, he said, in the direct, unembellished way she had already come to appreciate about him. We were able to complete the full reconstruction. The structural repair is clean. His airway is stable. He paused. The recovery is going to take time. He's going to be frustrated with the restrictions. Make sure he understands that the restrictions are what make the repair permanent. I'll make sure, she said. Her voice was slightly unsteady. He's asking for you, Ewan added. He's in recovery. He can't speak yet. We'll keep him on voice rest for the first week, but he's been writing notes. His first one said, and I'm reading this accurately, "Tell Clara the carbonara was worth it." Clara laughed. It came out shakier than she intended and turned into something that was not quite crying but adjacent to it, briefly, for about 4 seconds, and then she got it under control. Ewan watched this with the composure of a man who had delivered good news in waiting rooms for 20 years and understood the specific geography of the moment between hearing it and believing it. "Thank you," she said, "for taking his case." "Mr. Cross made a compelling argument for the urgency," Ewan said, with the slight dryness of a man who had been contacted by Ethan Cross's assistant with the specific efficiency that Ethan's assistant brought to everything. And the case itself was interesting. The presentation was unusual enough that my colleagues wanted to review it anyway. He paused. "Your documentation was thorough. The timeline you prepared. It was useful in the pre-operative planning." She blinked. "I just organized what I had." "You organized it well," he said, with the same directness she'd been giving and receiving for weeks. "You're in nursing school?" "Starting in January." He nodded. "Good," he said, in the same way Priya had said it. As a fact, not a compliment. She went in to see Danny. He was in a recovery bed looking pale and smaller than usual in the way people always look in hospital beds. Even Danny, who was 5'11" and had her father's broad shoulders, and who had spent enough time in hospitals that he no longer found them frightening. His throat was bandaged. He had a whiteboard on the tray beside him, the kind with the dry erase marker attached on a string, and he had already filled half of it with writing in the cramped hand he used when he was trying to fit a lot onto limited space. She sat in the chair beside him and read the board. "Did it work?" "Yes," she said. "It worked." He closed his eyes, just for a moment, a brief private moment that she looked away from to give him. When she looked back, he was erasing the board and writing again. "The card from the kid, Mia," Clara said. "She's good people. She's 8. "Still good people." Clara smiled. "She has follow-up questions about your procedure." He wrote, "Tell her I'll do a full debrief when I can talk. She'll hold you to that." He looked at her. His dark eyes, her father's eyes, the one thing they'd both gotten from a man who hadn't given them much else, were tired and post-anesthesia slow, but there was something in them that was lighter than she'd seen in a long time. The specific lightness of a weight lifted. He wrote slowly, "Clara." She waited. "Thank you." She put her hand over his on the bed rail. She didn't say anything. She had spent 30 years being the person who didn't say certain things because she didn't know how. Danny knew that. He had always known it. He had never needed her to be different. They sat like that for a while, in the recovery room with its specific hospital hum, while the afternoon came in through the small window and the city went about its business outside. And it was enough, more than enough. It was the thing she had been working toward for 8 months, and it was real, and she let herself feel all of it without managing it or containing it or filing it away for later. The investigation into Raymond Holt concluded, in its formal legal sense, 4 months after the dinner at the Harlow Room. Holt's medical license was suspended pending a full board review, a process that Kowalski had accelerated by filing the complaint with a specificity and a volume of documentation that left the review board very little room to move slowly. The civil suit was filed concurrently. Holt, faced with the choice between fighting on 2 fronts or cooperating with one, chose cooperation, and in doing so confirmed what the medication records and Reyes's analysis had already established. The protocol had been designed to produce dependency and periodic acute episodes, not to treat the underlying condition. He named Pierce. Pierce, located in a suburb of Philadelphia where he had been working as a private security consultant, initially denied everything with the particular confidence of someone who believed they had covered their tracks well enough. He had not covered them well enough. The digital trail between his communications and Holt's prescription adjustments was not the kind of thing that disappeared cleanly, and Kowalski had a forensic accountant who was very good at finding the kind of thing that wasn't supposed to be found. Pierce had been paid, over 2 years, through a series of shell accounts that traced, not directly, but with sufficient evidentiary weight, to a financial structure that a German investment holding company used for discretionary transactions, a holding company in which Klaus Brenner held a controlling interest. The connection to Brenner was never provable in a criminal sense. International jurisdiction, the insulating layers of corporate structure, the distance between instruction and execution, all of it created gaps that the law could see but not bridge. Brenner's lawyers were very good. He denied everything with the polished composure of a man who had always been polished and composed, and the denials would probably hold in any court that required proof beyond reasonable doubt. What they would not hold against was disclosure. Ethan Cross released the full documented conflict of interest, Brenner's position in the Kellerman competing deal, the financial structure linking Brenner to Pierce, the timeline of Pierce's contact with Holt, to every major financial news outlet simultaneously on a Thursday morning in March. He did it without fanfare and without a press conference. Just a document, sourced and footnoted, sent at 9 in the morning to 47 journalists and financial analysts. By noon, Brenner had withdrawn from the Kellerman deal. By 3, 2 of his European investment partners had issued statements distancing themselves from his activities. By the following Monday, he had resigned from 3 boards and issued a statement through his lawyers that was, in the specific language of legal non-admission, essentially an admission. He was never charged with anything. Ethan had known this would probably be the outcome. He had told Clara, on the afternoon before the release, that he understood the limits of what the law could do. "Then why are you doing it?" she'd asked. They were in his office, the late March light different from the November gray she'd first known in these rooms. Warmer, longer, the lake visible again through the window. "Because the financial community runs on reputation," he said, "and because every investor and partner he has will spend the next 5 years wondering. That's its own consequence." He paused. "It's not justice, but it's something." She had thought about that for a while, about the gap between justice and something, and whether something was ever enough. And the answer she kept arriving at was, sometimes it had to be, and making peace with that was its own kind of work. "It's enough," she had said. He had looked at her. "You really believe that?" "I believe that burning your life down waiting for perfect justice is its own kind of loss," she said. "You got the company back, Danny got the surgery, Holt lost his license, Pierce is going to prison." She met his eyes. "Sometimes the pieces land where they land, and you decide if what you have is enough to build on." He was quiet for a moment. "When did you get this pragmatic?" he said. "I've always been this pragmatic," she said. "You just spent the first 3 months interpreting it as something else." The corner of his mouth moved. "What did I interpret it as?" "Composure," she said. "People see a calm woman and they think composure. Usually it's just someone who decided a long time ago that panic was not a useful tool." He looked at her with the expression she had a name for now. She had given it a name sometime in January, quietly, to herself. The way you name things you want to be able to think about precisely. It was the expression of a man who was paying full attention, not to a problem, not to a situation, but to a specific person. The undivided kind. The kind that was, in her experience, genuinely rare. She had stopped looking away from it approximately 6 weeks ago. The acquisition closed on a Friday in April. $6.2 billion. Announced in a press release that Cross Technologies' communications team had spent 3 weeks drafting, and Ethan had substantially simplified in the final hour, cutting it down to the facts, and removing what he called the congratulatory language that makes it sound like we're surprised we succeeded. Marcus Webb had looked at the simplified version with the expression of a man whose professional instincts were at war with his personal feelings, and his personal feelings were winning. "This is very spare," he said. "It's accurate," Ethan said. "Ethan, this is a $6 billion deal. People expect—" "I don't care what people expect. Send it." Marcus sent it. The markets responded well. Investor confidence, which had taken the November hit and then recovered incrementally through the winter as the legal situation clarified, moved decisively upward on the day of the announcement. Cross Technologies closed the week at its highest stock price in 18 months. Ethan took no particular satisfaction in the number itself. Clara had noticed this about him. He was not indifferent to the company's success, but his relationship to the financial metrics was instrumental. They were measurements of whether the machine he'd built was functioning, not evidence of his worth. She found this, on reflection, healthier than she'd expected from a man who'd spent 8 years building a billion-dollar company. He was getting better. Not dramatically, not in the way movies suggested healing happened, sudden and visible and conclusive. In the actual way, gradually, with setbacks, with the occasional morning where the old tightness came back and reminded him that the condition was managed rather than cured. He had been seeing Dr. Ewan directly, and Ewan had put him on a protocol that was, as Reyes had predicted, significantly more effective at reducing episode frequency. He still had the occasional attack. He probably always would. The underlying condition was real, and it was his. But he could breathe. Most days, without counting. He had told Clara this in February, after a follow-up appointment with Ewan, sitting in his car in the hospital parking structure because he'd texted her about the appointment, and she'd asked how it went, and somehow they'd ended up on the phone for 40 minutes. He had said, "I drove here this morning and realized I didn't think about it once. The whole drive, I just drove." She had understood exactly what that meant. Clara started nursing school on January 14th. The program was a 12-month accelerated track for students with prior academic credit, designed for people who had started and stopped and had the documented foundation to move efficiently toward completion. She had applied in December during the week of Danny's surgery, filling out the application at her kitchen table on a night when Ethan had texted her a photo of Mia's anatomy card, and she had felt, perhaps for the first time in years, that the future was a place she was moving toward rather than away from. She had been accepted in 3 weeks. The first day of class, she sat in the third row of a lecture hall on the UIC campus with a new notebook and the specific quality of nervous energy that came not from doubt, but from the feeling of beginning something that mattered. The professor was a clinical educator named Dr. Sandra Park, who opened the first class with, "Half of you will wonder in week 3 why you came back. The half of you who stay anyway are the ones this field actually needs." Clara had written that down. She was managing nursing school and a reduced schedule at the Meridian simultaneously, which was the kind of balance that was sustainable if you were organized and brutal about sleep and had learned, through necessity, to compartmentalize with precision. Gerald had given her Monday, Wednesday evening shifts and kept her off the Harlow room rotation. Not out of delicacy, but because the Harlow room generated the occasional journalist who had not yet found a better story to pursue. And Gerald was a practical man. She had discovered, good at nursing school in the way she had always suspected she would be, but had not allowed herself to believe. Not effortlessly good. Nothing real was effortless. But the kind of good that came from caring about the work and having the specific prior knowledge that classroom learning could build on instead of starting from scratch. Her professor in clinical procedure had pulled her aside after the 3rd week and said, "You have the instinct for it. Don't second-guess the instinct." She had heard those words before, from a different professor years ago. Hearing them again was something she allowed herself to feel for a full minute before moving on. Danny's recovery was slower than his impatience with it. By February, he was on restricted voice use and modified diet and a physical therapy regimen for the throat musculature that he described, via text, as genuinely humiliating in its specificity. By March, he was speaking in full sentences and cooking again, including the carbonara that he made for Clara on a Sunday afternoon in early April when the Chicago cold had finally begun to ease and the light through his apartment windows was doing the thing spring light did, softer and more angled than winter, landing differently. She had eaten 2 bowls and not apologized for either. "You look different," Danny said, watching her. "Different how?" "Less like you're holding something back." He poured more wine. "Like you've put something down." She looked at her bowl. "Maybe. Is it the school?" "Partly." He looked at her with the specific patience of a younger sibling who had spent 30 years watching his older sister manage things she refused to discuss and had learned to wait her out. She looked back at him. "Don't. I'm not doing anything. You're doing the waiting thing." "I'm eating pasta," he said, with dignity. She put her fork down. "It's complicated," she said. She stopped. Started again. It started in a very strange way. And he's very private, and I'm very private. And we spent 4 months being honest with each other about everything except the one thing that... She stopped again. Danny waited. It's complicated, she said again. Clara. His voice was gentle in the way it only got when he had decided something was important enough to be direct about. You ran toward a man who was dying when an entire room full of people stood there. That's not complicated. That's who you are. He paused. The only complicated part is whether you're going to let yourself have the thing that happens after. She looked at the window, the spring light on the buildings across the street. I don't know how to do that, she said. It came out more honest than she'd intended and more raw. I know, Danny said, but you figured out the other thing you didn't know how to do. Took you about 11 days. He picked his fork back up. I give you 2 more months, tops. She picked up her fork. You're very annoying. You raised me, he said. She took Mia to the aquarium on a Saturday in late April. It had been Mia's idea, which was how most things involving Mia happened. A direct, specific proposal delivered with the confidence of someone who had not yet learned that requests could be softened for social acceptability. She had texted Clara directly, having obtained Clara's number from her father's phone at some point with what Ethan had described as technically questionable methodology, and the text had read, "There is a deep-sea exhibit at the shed that has barrel-eye fish. I would like to go. Dad says I have to ask you directly instead of having him ask, so I am asking directly." Clara had replied Saturday at 10. Mia was not what Clara had expected, and she had expected something specific. She had expected Ethan's intensity in a smaller package, the compressed focus, the controlled quality. What she found instead was a child who was, yes, precise and direct, and occasionally alarming in her knowledge of obscure biological facts, but who was also, and this was the part that surprised her, funny. Genuinely, observationally funny in the way that children were funny when nobody had taught them to perform it yet. She had looked at a tank of cuttlefish for 3 solid minutes and then said, completely seriously, I think if I were a sea creature, I would be one of these because they seem like they're judging everyone, but they never say it. Clara had laughed so hard she'd had to press her hand over her mouth. Mia had looked pleased with herself in the specific way of people who have landed a joke and are taking note of it for future use. They spent 4 hours at the aquarium. Mia had a notebook. She came with a notebook, which Clara found deeply endearing and also entirely unsurprising. And she had questions about every exhibit that required actual answers rather than simplified ones, and Clara gave her actual answers. And by the 3rd exhibit, Mia had determined that Clara was someone worth talking to properly and had upgraded her accordingly, in the visible way children upgraded people when they'd decided. On the train home, Mia sat beside her and said, My dad is better. I know, Clara said. He was sick for a long time and he didn't tell me. She said it without accusation, with the particular factual neutrality of a child who had processed something and arrived at a position. I knew something was wrong because he would sometimes go very quiet in the middle of talking, but I didn't ask because I thought if I asked, it might make it more real. Clara looked at her. That's very perceptive. I looked it up, Mia said. It's called magical thinking, where you believe that not saying something prevents it from happening. She paused. It doesn't actually work. No, Clara said. It doesn't. Did you know he was sick before you helped him? I suspected something was wrong about 2 minutes before. Mia absorbed this. How? I watched him swallow, Clara said. The muscles in his throat were working wrong. I'd seen it before with my brother. Mia was quiet for a moment. Then, Danny, is he okay now? He's okay now, Clara said. He had his surgery in December. Mia nodded with the decisive nod of someone receiving confirmed information. Good, I told him he was going to be fine. She paused. I wanted to make sure I was right. Clara looked at this 8-year-old child who had sent a handmade anatomical get-well card to a stranger because she had determined it was the right thing to do, and felt something move through her chest that was warm and specific and a little overwhelming. You were right, Clara said. Mia nodded again. Case closed. She went back to her notebook. At the end of April, Ethan Cross held a small press event. Not the major kind, not a production, just a room and a podium, and the 47 journalists who covered the company regularly and a brief direct statement. He talked about the acquisition. He talked about the company's direction for the next year. And at the end, unprompted by any communication strategy, he talked about something else. He said that the past 5 months had changed the way he thought about a specific thing, about the difference between managing a problem and actually facing it. He said that there was a particular kind of damage that came from being too disciplined about not asking for help, that the company's recent difficulties had been made possible, in part, by the version of himself that kept everything contained and controlled and did not let people close enough to notice when things were wrong. He said this without melodrama, without the performance of vulnerability that public figures sometimes reached for when they wanted to seem relatable. He said it as a business lesson, almost, the way someone would describe a strategic error and the correction they'd made. But everyone in the room understood it was more than a business lesson. Clara watched the footage from her apartment that evening, sitting on her couch with her nursing school textbook open beside her, and Danny's voice on speakerphone providing a running commentary. "He's talking about you without saying your name," Danny said. "He mentioned me by name at the board meeting," she said. "That was professional acknowledgement. This is different." She watched Ethan on the screen, the navy suit, the steady directness of his delivery, the way he looked at the room with the same full attention he turned on everything. "Danny," she said. "Yeah. Go home. I'm already home." "I mean, stop listening," he laughed. "Good night, Clara." She hung up. She sat with the textbook and the footage until the footage ended and the screen went dark. She thought about the conversation with Danny in his apartment, about the things she didn't know how to do, about the folder that used to sit on the table, about 11 days in a legal pad and a cold email to a pharmacologist she'd never met. She had built the case from nothing. She had found the thing everyone else missed because they were too busy being intimidated by the room. She had walked back into buildings she had no structural power in and said the true thing and held her ground until someone with the ability to act on it decided to listen. She could do this too. She picked up her phone. His text came 12 seconds after hers, which she had expected. He was always precise about response time when it mattered. They had coffee the next morning, not in the building, not in a corporate room, but in a place that was just a place. A small coffee shop on Milwaukee Avenue that Clara had been going to for 3 years, with mismatched chairs and a barista who never remembered her name but always remembered her order. She had chosen it deliberately. Neutral ground. Ordinary ground. A place where no one had a title. He was there before her, which surprised her. He had found a corner table and was sitting in one of the mismatched chairs looking slightly out of place in his good coat, like something that belonged somewhere more polished that had wandered into an honest space and was deciding it preferred the honesty. She sat down across from him. They looked at each other. "Hi," she said. "Hi," he said. He looked slightly uncertain, which was not a thing she'd seen on him before, and which she found she did not find alarming. Uncertainty on Ethan Cross looked like the natural result of being in a situation that his usual operating systems weren't designed for. She understood that. She was in it too. "I watched the press conference," she said. He looked at his coffee cup. "I went off script." "I know. It wasn't planned." "I know that too." She paused. "It was the most honest thing I've seen you say publicly." He looked up. "That's a low bar given what I usually say publicly." "It's not a low bar," she said. "Most people never say the honest thing publicly. Most people can barely say it privately." He was quiet for a moment. The coffee shop hummed around them. The steamer, the music that was slightly too loud for the morning hour. The 2 students at the next table arguing about something in the comfortable way of people who had been arguing about things for long enough that it had become a form of affection. "I'm trying to figure out how to say something," he said, "which is unusual for me." "Take your time," she said. "I'm not going anywhere." He looked at her. "I know you're not." He said it with a certainty that was not assumption but observation. The specific certainty of someone who had been paying very close attention for 5 months to who a person actually was. "Since November," he started. "Since the first time I looked at you on that floor and you looked back." He stopped. Tried again. "I have been operating at the edge of something that I don't fully know what to do with. And I've spent my whole professional life at the edge of things I don't know what to do with, and I've always found a way to calculate through it." He paused. "This is not calculating." "No," she agreed. "I don't know how to do this," he said. The same words she'd said to Danny. in the same honest register. I haven't done this. The actual version of this, not the version where I keep everything at a managed distance, since before I understood how much easier the managed distance was. She looked at him. I don't know how to do it either, she said, in case that's useful information. Something shifted in his face. How is that supposed to be useful information? Because, she said, it means neither of us is behind. We're starting from the same place. He looked at her for a long time. The coffee shop, the mismatched chairs, the ordinary morning doing its ordinary thing around them. Mia likes you, he said, which was not what she expected, but which she understood. For him, this was a fact that mattered more than most facts, and stating it was its own form of honesty. I like her, Clara said. She's going to be formidable. She already is, he said, with the specific note in his voice that was only there when he talked about his daughter. The unguarded note, the one that didn't calculate. Then she has good training, Clara said. He looked at his coffee, then back at her. I want to try, he said simply. I'm not certain I know how. I'm probably going to be bad at some of it. I have a lot of habits that don't work for this. He paused. But I want to try. She looked at the man across the table, not the billionaire. She had never been particularly interested in the billionaire. The man, the one who went quiet when things hit hard, who sent statements where other people sent questions, who told his 8-year-old daughter the hard thing was real because she asked, who had been slowly poisoned for 2 years and had spent all of it alone because he didn't know another way to be, and who was sitting across from her in a coffee shop on Milwaukee Avenue on an ordinary Tuesday morning trying to say the thing. I want to try too, she said. He exhaled. Just barely. The way people exhaled when they'd been braced for something and the something turned out to be manageable. I'm going to be in nursing school for another 9 months, she said, and I work 3 evenings a week, and I study the other evenings, and I'm not a person with a lot of spare time. I have a company and a daughter, he said. Spare time is not a concept I operate with. Then we understand each other, she said. We've understood each other since November, he said, with a directness that landed clean and clear. She picked up her coffee. He picked up his. Outside the window, Milwaukee Avenue was doing its thing. The morning foot traffic, the delivery trucks, a cyclist navigating the too narrow bike lane with practiced optimism, a dog on a leash pulling its owner towards something important only the dog knew about. The city indifferent and alive and full of ordinary things that were the actual substance of a life. Clara Bennett sat in a mismatched chair in a coffee shop she'd been going to for 3 years and felt, for the first time in a long time, no gap between where she was and where she was supposed to be. She thought about the folder on the kitchen table, about the train at midnight, about the 47 seconds of security footage and the 47 minutes of boardroom honesty, about Danny's whiteboard and Mia's anatomical get-well card, and a legal pad with 2 columns written in her own handwriting in the early morning dark. She thought about what it meant to pay attention, to really pay attention, not just to the obvious things, not just to the things people put in front of you and said, look at this, but to the small things, the micro-expression in a crowded room, the way someone swallowed, the pattern no one else thought to look for because they were too busy being overwhelmed by the room. She had always paid attention. It was the one thing she had always done. She hadn't always known what it was worth. She knew now. Some of what had happened over the past 5 months was luck. The timing, the placement, the specific accident of her being in the Harlow room that night instead of on the 41st floor. She was honest enough to admit that. The world was full of people with the right knowledge in the wrong place, and she'd been the right knowledge in the right place on that particular Tuesday night, and some of that was just what it was. But some of it was not luck. Some of it was 30 years of paying attention and building the knowledge, and staying in the room when leaving was easier. Some of it was Danny teaching her without knowing he was teaching her what it meant to keep showing up for something even when showing up was hard. Some of it was her making the choice over and over to be the person who stepped forward instead of the person who stood and watched. That part was not luck. That part was hers. Ethan Cross looked at her across the table in the ordinary morning light, and she looked back, and neither of them said anything for a moment because nothing needed saying. Outside, Chicago kept going. The lake was there, flat and enormous, and perpetually indifferent, the way it had been through everything. The collapse, the investigation, the surgery, the press conferences, all of it. Doing what large bodies of water did, which was simply remain and hold the light and make everything else seem the right size. Clara finished her coffee. Ethan finished his. They stayed for another hour. They didn't talk about anything significant. They talked about Mia's upcoming school science fair, which involved a project on deep-sea bioluminescence that had apparently exceeded the standard requirements by approximately 4 grade levels. They talked about Danny's plan to go back to the community college he'd had to leave when the medical bills started, in the fall, to finish his business degree. They talked about a restaurant on Damon that Clara had been meaning to try for a year and hadn't gotten to, and Ethan said he knew the owner, and she gave him the look she gave him when he did the thing where resources materialized, and he said, "Or we could just go, like people." Like people, she agreed. It was not a dramatic ending. It was not a conclusion so much as a continuation. The place where a story stops being about the crisis and starts being about the ordinary, complicated, imperfect, ongoing life that comes after. The part that doesn't fit in 47 seconds of footage. The part that requires showing up day after day in the mismatched chairs. That was the part that was just beginning. And it was, Clara thought, more than enough.